Okay, we're going to talk about spousal violence today. This is Chapter 10 of your textbook. Chapter 10 is divided into two sections. The first part talks about, it's titled Domestic Violence. Domestic violence includes all sorts of violence that happens in the family, so child abuse, that sort of thing. So really what we're talking about today is spousal violence, so violence that occurs between intimate partners. We already talked a little bit about domestic violence, and it was in one of the earlier chapters. So we'll talk about spousal violence today. And then the second part of Chapter 10 talks about sexual offenders. Okay, so today is spousal violence. On Wednesday, we'll have a guest lecture. I haven't heard back from Kevin, but he did tell me he could come in a number of weeks ago, so hopefully Kevin Nunes will be coming in on Wednesday. So this class, we're talking about the prevalence of domestic violence, or I should say spousal violence. And I will be adding some new research that's just recently come out about violence within dating relationships to make it more relevant to you guys. I'll talk about why women stay in abusive relationships. I have a short clip from England about two women who were domestically abused or violently abused in their relationships, and they talk a little bit about their relationships. I'll talk about what theories have been proposed to describe spousal violence and whether treatment works. Okay? The last slide, should I not get to it in time, provides some resources for you or your friends or anyone you know who might need to get out of an abusive relationship. So the helpline's there. There is about 569 shelters in Canada where you can go to get into a safe spot. So I give you the link to shelters.ca where you can find the shelters in the Ottawa, Gatineau region. Okay, so if I don't get to that, you can look on WebCT for that last slide. I guess the other thing I need to talk about, Quiz 2 will be released this afternoon. We inputted it into WebCT this weekend. I want to go through it one more time before we release it. So I'm going to release it at 3 p.m. today, so you'll have all this week to do quiz number 2. So for those of you who did not do quiz 1, this is your last chance to get that 5%. Okay, so if you've done quiz 1, this is certainly optional. As I mentioned in the course outline, I will take the higher mark of quiz 1 versus quiz 2. So I would encourage you to go ahead and do it anyway. Like quiz 1, there's 20 multiple choice questions. Those are the chapters that will be covered on the quiz. Now, more chapters clearly will be covered for the final, but these are chapters from weeks 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so that's what's going to be covered on the quiz. It is based on, those chapters are based on the second edition. I know some of you have the first edition, some of you have the preliminary edition. So those chapters do not map on to the chapters that are in your textbook. So for those of you who do not have the most current version of forensic psychology, and I've had email exchange with you, you need to go to the library or borrow someone's book and then go through and compare what you have to what's in the actual textbook we're using, okay? So that you make sure you're reading the right chapters. Lectures 12 to 17, so that covered fitness to stand trial, not criminally responsible, all the sentencing, parole, that chapter, or that and those lectures. Risk assessment, right? You need to know that 2x2 table, false positive, false negatives. You need to know what is the static versus dynamic risk factor. And Caleb, who guest lectured last Wednesday, he's provided me with questions, and I've added those questions, well, a few of those questions to the quiz. Okay? So you have an hour to do it. This time we've disallowed answers after an hour. So you have to keep track of that little countdown time up in the corner. It counts down. You start it. It counts down from 60 to 0. So you do have to make sure you submit your answers before that gets to 0, or your answers will be not be submitted. Okay, so you only have 1 hour to do it. So you can go ahead and try it right now or at 3 o'clock when I release it. I would urge you to go through your lecture notes and read the material first. That'll be a much quicker way. I don't believe, I probably will be corrected, I got rid of a lot of the negatively worded questions. I got rid of any of the questions that had A and B or B and C to make it somewhat easier for you guys. So I'm hoping that you do well. I mean, you did very well in the last quiz, at least those who took the quiz, right? 40% got the A rank. So we'll see what happens. Once the quiz closes on Friday, minute before midnight, then we will release the answers to you like we did last time. Okay, any questions about the quiz? Okay, so we're going to talk about spousal abuse. Here's the definition I'll be using. Any violence, mistreatment that a man or woman experiences, so it's both men or women, at the hands of a marital, common law, or, and I'd put common law, and I'd add dating partners. Okay? So it could be a same-sex partner, heterosexual partner. So really, any violence, right, that can occur within your intimate relationships. Okay? I'm not talking about with your family, but I'm talking about with the spouse, partner, or dating relationships. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Typically, like all forms of family violence or domestic violence, initially up until the 1980s, this was seen as a private matter, none of anyone else's business, so it was typically kept hidden. So there was not a lot of research up until the 1980s about domestic violence in general, child violence, right, parents being abusive towards their children, and spousal violence or intimate partner violence. So certainly in the last 20, 30 years, there's a huge amount of empirical research in the psychology area. Like with child abuse and elder abuse, there are different types of violence you can experience. I mean, the most obvious type of violence would be physical violence. So slapping, pinching, biting, kicking, beating, choking, burning, etc. Okay, so often when people think of spousal abuse, they think of physical violence. And initially, Murray Strauss developed what's called the conflict tactic scale. So at the beginning of the textbook, the conflict tactic scale is described in a lot of detail. Okay, so this was the measure that nearly everyone uses, and it's the measure that I will show you. I won't show you the measure, you can read about it in the book, but I'll show you the results from the measure that Stats Canada has used and this international dating study has been using. So the conflict tactic scale, initially, and you can read about the critique about this scale, was developed and focused on minor and more severe acts of physical violence. It was critiqued because it ignored sexual violence. It didn't even ask about sexual violence. The assumption when Murray Strauss developed this scale, well, sexual violence, we're talking about intimate partners, right? A man and his wife, right, or a spouse, right, or whatever. So sexual violence, does it really occur or not? So when he developed the scale in the 1980s, it wasn't even in his agenda or in his mindset that there would be sexual violence occurring. Yes, physical violence. Yes, to some degree, verbal aggression, but not sex. And certainly we know now that within intimate partner relationships, there's a huge amount of sexual violence occurring. So the Conflict Tactics 2 scale, which is again described in the textbook, has expanded to include sexual violence. Okay? Emotional violence. Okay, and you can hear these two women talking about this sort of issue. This is the most common type of violence or abuse, right? Where calling names, belittling you, isolating you, not allowing you to have your friends over, not allowing you to see family members, okay? Making threats of what he or she will do to you. So certainly the emotional component of this is the most common. And then there's the economic or financial. Okay, so where someone will not allow a person to have access to an account, a bank account, where that person will give you a salary or an allowance, give you a couple $100, and then you can spend that to get the groceries, pay the bills, etc. Okay? So that even if you have a paycheck, the person may well say that paycheck will go into this account, then you will not have access to that account. So that would be the economic type of financial abuse. So how widespread is it? It's going to depend on how you measure it, obviously. Okay? So if I were to ask you how you're going to measure, okay, spousal violence, can you give me some suggestions? Like, how are we going to know how common it is, let's say, here in Ottawa, Ontario, or Canada? I already gave you a hint earlier. Okay, if you wanted to do the study, right, to look at the prevalence of who is experiencing this, what would you do? No one wants to answer. Yeah?
Either visit NGOs such as women's shelters or Ottawa Emergency Center,
Okay.
where they would actually have people coming to them and just see how many people amongst who they have and how many clients they have.
Okay, so you could go, what she said was go to NGOs, shelters, maybe emergency departments, and find out how many abused men or women, I guess mostly women, come to these places so they could report back to you how many they're receiving. Okay, so certainly you can go to that type of location. That's typically called a victimization survey, although you're surveying the individuals running the shelter, right?
Well, because usually there's confidentiality with NGOs, so I don't know if you can get directly with the person who has shelter.
Right. Okay. Well, yes. Right. This is confidential. These individuals are often in hiding. Right. They're trying to avoid any contact with their abusive spouse. So, but typically, yes, if you can go in and collect data on the individuals in shelters and have them complete some sort of survey to get a sense of what type of abuse they experienced, right, and how frequent it was, when it started, that sort of thing. Okay, that's good. So we've got the shelters we could go to. How else could you do it? What have we talked about a lot when we talked about trying to get numbers? Yeah? Pardon me? Yeah, so you go to the police, right? If you hear your, well, hopefully you don't, but let's say you hear your neighbors or fighting, and it seems to be escalating, right? You may decide to phone 911 and the police might show up. So certainly the police as a source of information, right? At least it's across the country, right? So you can look at how many calls are for domestic violence calls, right? And you could code that, okay? Now what's the problem with using the police? Is it an underestimate or an overestimate? It's going to be an underestimate, right? Because a lot of individuals who are being abused probably won't call the police, right? For a whole variety of reasons. So I said official crime rates, that relates to the police. Self-report surveys. If I wanted to get a sense of how many of you personally are engaging in this, right? So if you yourself are engaging in this type of behavior, I could certainly ask you directly or via self-report or an online survey whether or not have you engaged in this behavior. And I could list a whole bunch of behaviors. And the conflict tactics scale has been used both as a self-report from the perpetrator side and a victimization survey on the victim side. Okay, so this scale has been used from both sides. We talked about victimization surveys, so I could ask the group of you again, have you ever been victimized or not? Right? So you could be both a perpetrator and you may well have been victimized in a different relationship. I could use informant reports. Who's likely to view domestic or spousal violence? Who's the most likely people to view spousal violence? Pardon me? Oh, kids, you said it. Kids, yeah, children, right? So they're living in the home, right? They might, well, maybe they don't view it, but they might hear. So I could, if I get around ethics and confidentiality, and if the parents would give me permission, I could go in and ask children, have you seen or heard the following? Okay, so that would be an informant report. Certainly I could wait till these kids are older, right? I could ask you guys, did you see domestic violence? Did you see your parents engage in this behavior or not? Okay? And finally, there's things called, you can do direct observation. There are studies that put video cameras in homes, right? And then tape what happens in the home, and then you can code these tapes afterwards. Typically what happens is the individuals initially are very inhibited by knowing that there's a camera there, so they don't engage in abusive behavior, obviously, when they're going to be taped, right? Because they'll think, well, obviously this could potentially be used as evidence against me, even though there's maybe this confidentiality agreement with the researchers. So there's not very much research looking at direct observation. The other studies that have happened is bringing couples in conflict into the lab. So I don't think you're a couple, but anyway, here's a couple I have. So I could invite them into the lab, and then I would get you to talk about something that you're in conflict about. I don't know what it would be, finances or whatever. And then I would view you through a one-way mirror. And then I would look at how you interact with each other. Okay, so that could be direct observation. And they've done that. There's been a number of psychologists bringing individuals into the lab and looking at how they speak to each other. Does one person stop and listen to the other or not? Okay? Do you want to come in to the lab? No. You're not. Okay. You're not. Okay. About 2 years ago, every year, Stats Canada reports about the prevalence of spousal violence. So of all the violence reported to the police, okay, 15%. Now I don't know if this is a smaller or larger percent than what you would anticipate, but 15% of all reported violence relates to incidents of spousal violence. Okay. There's a whole bunch of other violence, armed robberies and assaults, etc. Of those reported, the victims, or 8 of the victims, are female and 2 are male. Okay, so there is certainly a gender unbalance here. So more women. Now this is this is the official record. So this is what's being reported by the police rather than self-report. There's higher prevalence of police reports in Quebec and Nunavut. Okay, so there's more police reporting in those 2 provinces and territory than in BC, Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick. Okay, Ontario's right smack in the middle. Okay, and it's again, it may be related to other issues. In Nunavut, the age of the population, the level of alcohol problems, which again is related, is a risk factor for spousal violence. Poverty is a risk factor, not because people are poor, because of the number of stressors they're under, okay, which will lead to increased conflict with their relations. So there's lots of different reasons why. One of the reasons could be, and it's not that Quebec has a lot of the reasons I just said about Nunavut, could be that the police in Quebec have zero tolerance. So when they go to a domestic violence incident and there's someone there and there's evidence of some sort of injury, they will arrest someone. Where out east, or I guess on the west coast as well, there may be more discretion in making a decision, am I going to arrest this person or not? And we'll come back to mandatory reporting later on. The most common type of arrest is common assault. So this is assault level 1. So this is where you've slapped someone, you've hit them, you've punched them, okay? So where there's no serious injury. Because if there's a serious injury, then you're going to go up to more serious forms of assault, assault causing bodily harm, or other forms of aggravated assault. So if you, 62% or I'm not saying this is minor, you can get hurt being punched in the face, right? And it's not acceptable that people slap, right, each other and all of that. But certainly the most common form of police reporting is common assault. Then major assault, where there's a weapon involved, or where there's serious injury, broken bones, etc. Uttering threats, I'm going to kill you if you leave me. This is quite common, right? So in a domestic abusive relationship, someone threatens to leave, and the other person says, I'll kill you if you leave me. Okay? And we certainly have had an example of this recently. An ex-boyfriend attempted to murder his girlfriend, or his ex-girlfriend, and then he went back to her house and killed himself, and he died. So committed suicide after this attempt. Some individuals utter threats, and the individuals who leave a domestic violence situation are actually at highest risk for homicide after leaving. Okay? So often they say, well, it's better that I stay in the relationship because I can monitor what he or she is doing. If I leave the relationship, they've made threats, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill the kids, I'm going to kill your family, I'm going to kill your pet. Right? This is abuse directed towards pets, a very common part of this whole spectrum. So often people will sort of hesitate at leaving, right, because of these threats. And you certainly see this in the media, right, where someone's left and then someone's gone in and killed the person and sometimes killed the whole family. Stalking behavior, criminal harassment is also pretty common, right? You leave and the person harasses you, stalks you. Then others include things like kidnapping, homicide, etc. Okay? 78% of the time charges are laid. So even though we do have mandatory reporting legislation where police are actually required to arrest someone if there is evidence that a physical injury has occurred. So we've had mandatory reporting since 1983, the RCMP, in 1985 across Canada. But that doesn't mean that every time there's a domestic violence call, they're going to arrest someone. Okay, so but it used to be, if you go back, before 1980s, that only in about 5%, 5 to 10% of domestic violent calls was anyone arrested. It was very rare back before the 80s that anyone would get arrested. Now certainly there were still police coming to homes because people were involved in domestic violence. So certainly the impact of the mandatory charging policies has to increase dramatically by 7 times, up to 8 times, right, the police charging someone. Before they had these mandatory reporting legislation, the victim would have to go to the police and say, yes, I want to charge him with whatever. And the police soon realized that victims were not in that position to do that because they were very scared of the individual. So that's why they implemented this idea of mandatory reporting. It will be the police officer's decision, not the victim's decision. Right? And hopefully that would take, it has had a negative effect of taking control away from the victim. It's also had a negative impact of victims not wanting to phone the police because they actually want the abuse to stop, but they don't want their husband or boyfriend or girlfriend to be arrested. Right? And they're worried that if the police does get called, that's what's going to happen. Female victims, if the victim is a female, 80% of the time charges will be laid by the police. If the victim is a male, in only 66% of times will charges be laid. So there does seem to be a gender, again, bias here. Well, police are much more willing to arrest men than women, even though the mandatory reporting covers both sexes. Okay, so in your textbook, in box 10.1, so right at the beginning of the textbook, it talks about what about husband abuse. There's hardly any research, now it's getting better in the last 5 years, but there has been hardly any research on men who experience domestic violence. Okay, so everyone's been focused on the victim is a female. The victim who's a female, if she does engage in any violence, it is defensive violence. Okay? So if my spouse is threatening me and I punch him in the face, or I pick up a brick and throw it at him, well, that's not really her fault because she was in defensive because she thought he was going to attack her. So certainly there's well, there was more sort of belief a number of years ago that women simply do not engage in offensive, right, first sort of attack domestic violence. So the question in the box is domestic violence only male initiated? Right? It's only the man in the relationship who initiates it. And I'm guessing that you would all probably agree. The answer would be no, that's not true whatsoever. The more recent research, I mean, the problem is men were simply excluded from the research. In 1993, the first time Stats Canada did a survey, right, of domestic violence, spousal violence. They did this large survey published in 93. They didn't even ask men. They were not even participants in the survey. Okay, so all this research was always focused on the victims are women, men are the perpetrators. So the answer is yes, both men and women engage in the same amount of violence. Okay? So there's now with asking woman, do you engage in this violence? And I'm going to qualify it in a minute, but do you engage in slapping, biting, hitting, kicking, punching, choking? The answer is yes, we do. And men are admitting that they have been victimized by their female partners. Okay? Do males suffer any serious consequences? There was this myth out there that, well, yes, men and women might engage in acts of violence towards each other. Men are larger, they're stronger. So even though, yes, the woman, punches the guy, he's not going to get hurt anyway. Yeah, she can slap him and pinch him and pull his hair or whatever, or scratch him, but he's not going to get hurt. He can defend himself anyway. Certainly, there's research now suggesting that men fear for their life just like women in these domestic violence situations. I mean, if someone has a gun, it really doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you're going to be fearful. However, it is true, if you equate the type of violence, so if you equate punching, women will suffer more physical injury. Okay? And it sort of makes sense. But you start adding a weapon to it, knives, guns, etc., bats, right? Then, of course, the violence or the injuries suffered are the same. It's the same. Okay? Is there a gender bias in police response? We already know that there are. Certainly here in Canada, we have a gender bias. Okay? One study in the States with a female victim, 91% of the time, right? Here in Canada it was 80%, but 91% of the time the male was arrested. If it was a male victim, 60% of the time the woman was arrested. Okay? We had 80 and 66. Okay? So there seems to be the same trend in the United States as in Canada. When the police show up, they're much more likely to arrest the man. Now, the only time they're going to arrest if there's some sort of evidence of physical injury, right? Because that's when mandatory arresting policies kick in. If there is no injury, no apparent injury, right? And you can be, depending on what happens, you may not have a bloody eye or, a broken bone, etc. In that case, when women report, or who are the victim, 52% of the time, okay, 52% of the time the man is arrested. There's no physical injury on the woman. When the male reports that he's been victimized, only 13% of the time is the woman arrested, okay, when there's no physical injury. So both with physical injury present, which should really equate, right, because they both should be arrested the same amount if there's physical injury, there's a gender bias, and also for when there's no physical injury. Do the courts treat men and women charged with domestic violence the same? And the answer is, again, no. So again, there's a gender bias for the police response in the court. Women will be more likely to have charges dropped. Okay, so even though the police arrest the perpetrator, who's a female, she goes right to court, or she's going to go to court, but typically, more often than not, those charges are dropped. So she doesn't even, the prosecution drops the charges. So she doesn't even get to the trial stage. And the main reason for those charges being dropped is because her spouse or boyfriend refuses to testify. So he doesn't want to testify. He may have wanted her to be charged, but then he refuses. We've had 3 surveys, large-scale surveys here in Canada about domestic violence. These are telephone surveys, right? So someone phones you up and asks if you'll participate. In this case, there was a very good response rate. So they asked to talk to people who are over the age of 15 in the household, about 23,000. So this is a huge survey. Okay? This was done a number of years ago. And then they decided at that point that they would include looking at men in the survey as well as women. And then what they did is they took this conflict tactic scale that I described earlier, and they asked questions about physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Okay, so you're on the phone, someone from Stats Canada is phoning you, and they're asking you these questions. So these questions are similar to during the past year. So they want to look at what's happened in just the last 12 months versus the last 5 years. Okay, and then you're simply asked to report whether this has happened to you in your relationship or not. Typically, it starts with relatively less violence. Has this person threatened to hit you with his or her fist? Throwing anything at you that could hurt you. The conflict tactic scale prior to the modification just asked, throwing anything at you. Well, I don't know. I could pick up a pillow and throw it at someone, right? And this is not going to hurt that person, right? So then they modified it to add that could hurt you. Okay, so something that's potentially could cause damage. Pushed or shoved you in any way that could hurt you. Again, so they made it more stringent, right? Because it used to say pushed or shoved you. Well, how many times have you maybe pushed someone, right, or shoved them, and there's no damage, right? I mean, again, whether that's appropriate technique if you're in a conflict, but again, the issue here is, unless you specify what you're talking about, your estimates are going to be extremely high, right, in terms of the prevalence. Slapped you, kicked or bit you, hit you with something could have hurt you, again, rather than, hitting you with a pillow or whatever, right, hit you, beat you, choked you, used it or threatened you with a knife or gun. And then they have different forms of sexual assault. Okay, so physically forced you, drugged you to engage in sexual assaultive behavior. The sexual assault can sometimes include forced you to have sex against your will, okay, where there's no necessarily physical force. So here's the results from the most recent survey. If it's in black, that means there's no gender differences. Blue means that men experience more than women. And red means that females experience more than males. Okay? So threatened to hit you, right, 53%. This is for the past 5 years, not in the past 12 months. So the past 5 years, have you experienced this? 53% of men said yes. Okay, this is not whether they've done it. This is a victimization survey. Have you experienced it? And 61% of women. So in this case, women experience being threatened to hit with something that could hurt them. Threw something, about the same. Pushed or shoved, right? Women experience it more. Experience being slapped. Men are more likely to experience this than women. Kick, bit, or hit. Men are more likely to experience to be hit, kicked, or bit by their partner. Hit with something. no difference, right? Now this is hit with something that could injure you, okay? So, you know, a bat, a stick, whatever. Being beaten up, women experience that more often. And you can see these rates, 19%. That means 1 in 5 Canadian women are reporting in the last 5 years within their intimate partner relationships, they have experienced being beaten up. Okay? No difference with threatened with a knife or gun. So about 1 in 10 Canadian couples have experienced this. Okay? Choked, more women, 19%. Okay, 1 in 5. And having forced sex, none of the men admitted to this, that they were forced to have sex with their partner, and 16% of the women. So when you start looking at those percentages, right, this suggests that this behavior, at least as measured by this modified conflict tactics scale, and this is a relatively large sample. So this is not a victimization sample of individuals at a shelter. Have you experienced this? These are individuals in the community reporting that they've experienced this. Now, I'm guessing that if I had someone phone me up from Stats Canada and started asking me questions like this, right, am I going to exaggerate or minimize? Right? Well, I don't know. Maybe you think, well, they're here from Stats Canada, they want to find out about this. Would I maybe lie to increase the number of these things that I've experienced? Or would I be somewhat ashamed and embarrassed and want to minimize? Right? That's probably more like it. The other problem is, even though this had an 81% response rate, okay, 19% said no, thank you. Right? When they phoned you up, said, do you want to participate in this survey of violence? They said no. Now, it may be the person who said no because I don't experience that. I mean, I don't want to participate in your survey because I haven't been victimized. Right? So we've lost all the people who would say no. Or it might be that it was individuals who had been victimized saying, yes, I had that experience, so therefore I do want to participate. Okay? So it gets very difficult to know how completely accurate these numbers are. Okay, I've already mentioned this. Men and women engage in equal amounts of verbal and minor violence. That's true. Certainly, men perpetrate more severe violence, and that includes spousal homicide, and I'll talk about homicide next Monday, about the rates of spousal homicide. So more men kill their spouses than women kill the men in their lives. Beating, choking, and sexual assaults are more common. So some people say, well, sure, there's minor acts of violence that women engage in, and maybe a few acts of severe violence, but certainly men are engaging in most of the much severe, right, the way they can cause sort of more permanent damage. So controlling for type of violence, and I already mentioned this when I said about punching, women are more likely to sustain injury. Okay, so controlling for that sort of, the type of violence used. Okay, so this is from whether or not the violence was reported to the police. So 37% in this most recent survey, the female victims reported it to the police. Okay, so this does support what I was saying earlier, that it's certainly police reports are an underestimate of the true rate or prevalence of spousal violence. Okay, so 32% reported. This is up from the first survey they did in 1993. Okay, so 29% of women reported in 1993. So there certainly has been a shift, right, where there are more women being abused are willing to report. 78% was by the respondent or the victim. So the victim herself called the police. And 22% was someone else, like say a neighbor or a relative called the police about what was happening. For males, 17% reported. So much lower percent of males phoned the police to get help for this situation. And this time it was fewer of them phoned. So 50% of them phoned and said, I've been victimized. And more of them someone else phone the police, right? A neighbor, a relative, maybe a child who would witness this. So certainly, I mean, these rates, right? That's why you're going to find that if you use police reports, you're going to underestimate, right, the true prevalence. That's why victimization surveys or self-report surveys perhaps are a better way of going. So the question becomes, why do men and women, right, 17%, 37%, do not report? Why don't you think, I mean, you can think yourself, if you were punched in the face, right, here at school, at the university, or at a bar on campus, it would likely result in, if you were assaulted that way, you would likely phone the cops, right? Or if you're sexually assaulted, you might phone the cops, right? Or someone threatened you with a gun or a knife, held a knife or gun to your throat, right? You probably would phone. So why do women not report to the police? Just 3 reasons. Why do you think? Okay.
That they're scared. Like that they're scared that this stuff will kill them.
Okay, so that I already mentioned the threat. So what she said, they're scared that the spouse will kill them. So you're involved in a domestic violence situation, right? Right. Okay, so that you're worried he's uttered threats before, and you're worried that if you call the police, he might then carry out the threat. Right? What happens if the police show up? They don't arrest him, and they leave, and then you're left in the situation. And he knows that you called the police, right? Yeah?
I was going to say that, or the fear that, you know, if there's no physical signs of abuse, the police won't believe you, like nothing's going to change.
Okay. Okay, so what she's saying is if there's no physical signs of injury, and that's what will trigger mandatory arresting policy, if there's no physical signs, when the police show up, he may be able to say, no, I didn't do it, right, or blame you, or do whatever, so that, again, so they won't believe you. So you might not bother phoning the police, because if they're not going to believe you, and they're not going to do anything, right, why bother? Yeah? Something? I can't hear you. Learned helplessness. Okay, I'm going to thank you. Learned helplessness. Okay, so learned helplessness. I'll come back to the little doggies in a minute. And I'll show you the research that looked at learned helplessness. But learned helplessness is a belief that if you experience this time and time again, you've tried everything, right? You now have set the table before he comes home. You have the dinner ready for him. You've got the kids upstairs so they're not crying anymore, right? You've got everything perfectly. You've tried to change your behavior time and time again to avoid being beaten, and nothing works. Right? So over time, you've tried all these coping adaptive strategies. It doesn't work, so you simply give up. Right? So it was not even in your mindset, okay, now I'm going to call the police to help me. You're simply giving up. You're just simply surviving, right, from day to day. Yeah? They could. So the woman may feel partially responsible for what happened. Okay, so someone came home, they're in a bad mood, they just had something bad happen at school or work. They come home, they start talking. Maybe you didn't think you listened enough, or you weren't as sympathetic to their whatever the concerns. Or maybe you got a little angry, saying, look, I had a bad day too, and it escalates. So you said, well, I'm sort of partially to blame because of what I said. So I'm not going to phone the police because I feel some attribute, I feel some blame. Yeah? Okay.
They don't want to put their child through that sort of stress.
Okay, so they may not want to report to the police because they have children, and this is the father of their children, and they don't want to have their children not have a father, or have their children see what happens if the police come, the guy gets arrested and taken away. Right. Oh, yeah.
They don't know how or if they can survive without
Okay, they don't know how they're going to survive without them. Okay, so we're going to come back to this because I asked why do battered women stay, and a lot of these questions are the answers the same. Feared retaliation, you mentioned, right? It's too minor. Someone already mentioned this. It's too minor. Why get the police involved? I want to keep this private. I don't want my family and friends to know that I'm in an abusive relationship, right? And if the police come, everyone's going to find out, right? If he gets arrested. Belief, you've already mentioned this, that police can't help, right? That they're not going to view this as a serious event. What's the police going to do to help me with this circumstance? Shame or embarrassment. I don't want to be admitting that I'm a victim of abuse. I don't want the offender to be arrested. May also be, and the whole bunch of reasons why you might not want the offender to be arrested. So in this study they did of Stats Canada, they asked or looked at what variables were related to the woman phoning the police. So frequency, if it only happened once, so this is the first time it happened, 66% of those phoned the police. So very low, right? I mean, probably if you got punched in the face once, the individual apologized, says, I'm really sorry, I won't do it again, and this is very common, right? Then you believe that individual, you've had really good times with that individual, so you're not going to phone the police. If it happened 10 or more times, so this is the 10th, 15th, 20th, 30th time, about half phone the police. And you might wonder, well, you know, if it's happened that often, obviously whatever you're doing is not going to change this individual's behavior. But still, you get individuals staying for 15, 20, 30 years being abused. Okay? Severity of violence, if you got beaten up by the individual, 25% will phone the police. If the person tried to choke you, I mean, this is, again, very obviously, very, you know, either with a noose, scarf, or hands around your neck, 40% call the police. And if they threaten you with a knife or gun, 58%. Again, that's amazing, right? So someone puts a gun towards you or a knife at your throat, 58% of the, 58% of the time, they phone the cops. Now, so there must be some reasons why they're not calling, right? Because I'm guessing that if you were threatened this way outside the family, right? If a gun was pointed towards you or a knife held up to your neck or towards your stomach or whatever, you would be, I bet you the rates would be about 90%, right? That you would call the police. Children witnessing the violence, 43%. So if your kids see you being beaten up, you're more likely. And if you're physically injured, you're more likely. Okay, so if you've got some sort of physical injury. Okay, so all of this should be in your textbook. This is a new study they're doing. The World Health Organization is funding research on dating violence in university students. So you can Google international dating violence studies and the whole slew of research. So they have a website that you can download lots of information. I think they're at 32 different countries. So they're giving the same scale to 32 different countries across the world, university students. So they range in age from 19 to about 24 years old. They're asking similar questions to what Stats Canada asked here. So they used a modified conflict tactic scale. So any violence would include slapping, hitting, biting, shoving, throwing an object that could cause harm. Okay, so any violence, including minor violence. So severe violence would be beating, punching, choking, use of a knife or gun. Okay, so much more severe violence. And then sexual coercion is not sexual assault necessarily. Okay, so sexual assault is what they were looking for in the Stats Canada. But sexual coercion would include sexual assault, but it also include having sex against your will. So you said, no, I don't want sex. Your partner says, let's have sex. Refusing to use a condom. You ask the partner to use a condom or to take cautions and they refuse, or any other sort of sexual assaultive behavior. I don't have all the countries up here, but you see it certainly varies. So Israel has relatively low rates of dating violence. So these are all university students across different countries in social science courses. So most sociology, psychology, those sort of courses. Okay? So very similar probably to this group here. Anti-violence, the top group was Mexico. Had relatively high rates of anti-violence in dating partnerships. And this is asking for only the last year. So the last 12 months. Okay? So you, in order to participate in the study, you had to be dating someone at least for a month. Okay? That was the minimum requirement for you to participate in the study. There was about 1,300 in the Canadian sample. So 1,300 students from universities here in Canada participated. So Mexico had the highest rate of anti-violence. So about 40% in the last 12 months. Israel had the lowest. Belgium had very low rates. Sweden, Switzerland had very low rates as well. Canada was 22%. So about 1 in 5 Canadian university students report experiencing this sort of violence within their dating relationships. 7%, right, report experiencing being punched, choked, right? Those sort of knife or gun used against them. And 28% reported sexual coercion. So about 1 in 4. Okay? Now, this is just based on both men and women. About 65–70% of the sample were females. If in many social sciences courses, there's more females than men. So this is not drawn out by gender. So if you want to know about man versus woman, you can certainly go to the website, and they have it broken down into men and women university students, right? And whether how much they've experienced this sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to now move to this video clip of these two British women who experienced domestic violence. There we are. I mean, it's not any. They're just talking about it, so it's not too horrific.
Charming and lovely.
I met this man through a friend, and he was very charming. Everyone seemed to know him, like him. He was very sociable with everyone. I had no reason to suspect him of anything.
The statistics for domestic violence are very worrying indeed. It affects 1 in 4 women. 30% of cases start, in fact, in pregnancy. 6% of cases are, in fact, men. And shockingly, 2 women die every week in the UK as a result of domestic violence.
After a couple of months, I got pregnant. And it was from that point, it was unexpected, I have to say, and it was after that point, things changed. His behaviour changed. The controlling behaviour came into place then.
Within a few, on the honeymoon, it changed. He became very abusive. Looking back now, I realise that, there were problems back then that just escalated when I had my children.
When I tried to get out of the relationship, he held a knife to my stomach on one occasion, and another occasion he smashed my head into the wall, made out it was an accident.
My self-esteem was at rock bottom. He was very derogatory about me as a person, about my looks, my clothes, my everything. He was just very unpleasant most of the time. I always ended up saying sorry, even though I hadn't done anything, just to keep the peace.
Women are affected most, particularly women in the 16 to 24-year-old age range. Domestic violence is no respecter of wealth or culture. It can again occur across the whole socio-economic spectrum.
He isolated me from people that would say, hang on a minute, Zoe, what's he doing? What are you doing that for? Because he knew, looking back now, that anybody close to me would say, that's not normal, you shouldn't let him treat you like that.
I was about 4 months pregnant when I suspected that he was drugging me. I would wake up, I'd have, with hazy flashes, bits of memories, and I just didn't feel well at all. That's when I really did think, I'm losing my mind here. I was questioning my own sanity. Part of me knew something was very wrong, but I was being told by him I was mad. My family weren't believing me. So I really did question myself. I called a drugs helpline and explained to them that I was terrified that I was being drugged. They advised me to go to A&E, so I went to the hospital, I got the test, and it came back positive. It was a cocktail of amphetamines, cocaine and ecstasy. Obviously I was pregnant as well, so you can imagine the fears. As a result of that, the doctors couldn't tell me whether the baby would have been okay or not. Given the situation, along with that, I decided to have a termination.
We now know that children are seriously affected by domestic violence. It can affect their emotional development, their social development, it can make them very frightened and have a long-lasting impact for the whole of their lives.
One of my worries was for the children, and obviously I couldn't leave him because I didn't want to render my children and I homeless.
He had told me he would have my children, I have 2 children, he would have them picked up from school by somebody else, I would never see them again. So I was going through all kinds of threats.
At the end, my son became very abusive to me because he'd seen his father treat me that way.
It's very important that women feel safe to share the information that they're experiencing domestic violence. So it's important that if it's happening to you, you do seek help and you to talk to someone that you trust.
It was actually a colleague who put me in touch with the local domestic violence unit because I had a breakdown in her office and she felt that I needed some help and support.
Luckily I had heard of the Worth Project, so I made contact with them, and it was just such a relief for someone to listen to me, believe me, not judge me at all in any way, shape or form, and to be there with total support for me. It was an absolute relief, it was a lifeline.
Women can go to the police for help with domestic violence, but they can also go to other people that they trust. They can approach health service staff, they could talk to someone in the A&E department, they could talk to a GP, a midwife. Everyone these days is much more aware of what needs to be done and can advise on where to go for help.
As a woman on your own, going to the police, going to court, it can be very traumatic, but with the Worth Project, I wasn't alone. I was able to do it.
There is a lot more support available these days. Independent domestic violence advisors are based locally and you can be put in contact with these by the NHS or by the police.
Within 2 or 3 weeks after seeing the solicitor, that was it. I shut the door and I had to call the police, but he'd gone.
When I was told that he'd been given life, I was so relieved. I was exhilarated. I felt as if I was set free from a complete nightmare.
I realise now that just because he wasn't physically violent, that the emotional and mental abuse that I was suffering was equally as damaging, and I knew for myself and my children I had to get us out of it.
Go and seek help immediately, not to leave it, because things can escalate, they can get far worse. There is help out there, you will be believed, you will be supported.
I would just say to anybody that there is help out there. There are people that can support you and help you make that move, and you really have to do it for yourself as much as anybody else.
Okay, that's for UK, the helpline. But you certainly get the sense that the reason why these individuals...
For more information, visit www.nhs.uk.
Okay. Nice British accent. Okay. Oh, no, that's enough of you. Okay. So you get the sense that a lot of these women both these women didn't want to report, right? They were feeling isolated, right? One of them wanting to stay in the home, even though being physically abused because of the children. Some of them talking to other people who didn't believe them about the abuse. So there's research looking at why do battered women stay, denial of options, right? So if you're in a situation where you're being supported by your spouse, right, and you don't have any options where to go, but one woman talked about she didn't want to be homeless by leaving the relationship. So economic dependency on the individual. This is often the case, the belief that the violence will end. So you just have to change yourself some way. Okay? If you can change yourself, then you can stop the violence. So if you can stop getting him upset at you, right? And then it will hopefully end. They often blame it on some external factors. My spouse has a drinking problem. My spouse has a horrible job. My spouse has some sort of problems. So if there's something external, well, then we can change what's external, and then the violence will end. Often it gets to the point when they realize that this is internal. This guy enjoys the power and control he has over you. He's not going to change, right? So it doesn't matter what you do. That's when they start realizing, well, I will need to get out of this situation. Fear of reprisal we mentioned, and someone mentioned learned helplessness. This idea that, now these two women do not represent learned helplessness, believe that they're unable to control the violence. They simply lose all motivation to change. And I'm going to talk about the Jane Hirschman case next Monday, because she was a case where she killed her abusive spouse. So learned helplessness, sorry, I'll come back to the cycle of abuse in a minute. So Silligan, very famous research with animals, where he put a dog, I don't know if it was a little cute little sheltie like that, but anyway, he put a dog in this cage. It was a wire floor. There was a little low gate, like let's just say a foot high. So that's a dog. It looks like a dog. Tone. Okay, so you hear a tone, sort of like the alarm tone, a fire alarm tone, and then you go to engage in behavior. Then he electrified the floor. So it's not a very pleasant place to be, because your little pads of your feet are getting electrocuted. So what does the dog do? He looks around, runs around a few times, he yelps and whimpers, and he sees, oh, I'll try this. I'll jump over the gate, and I'll get to the other side, it's safe. Okay, so he's happy. So now you put him back to the other side, he hears the tone, what does he do? He immediately jumps over to the other side. So he learns very quickly, right, how to avoid getting shocked. Okay, don't do this at home to your puppies. It wouldn't be very nice, but anyway. Okay, so we get another situation. The only thing that's changed here is that you put a gate they can't escape from, right, a high gate, right, or you enclose one side completely. So there's no way they can escape. You do the same thing. You give a tone, the floor is electrified, the dog runs around, okay, and the shock goes off. You only get zapped for a few seconds. Then you do the tone again. He starts running around again, anticipating he's going to get hurt. You do it again and again and again. And what happens over time is they hear the tone, and then they just sort of sink down and lie down in the corner. They may defecate and whine, but they just give up. And you can put them back into the new scenario, right, with a low gate, where they could actually escape. Right? The other dog escaped right away, but you put these dogs that have been trained that they can't escape into the other scenario with this little tiny gate that they could easily jump over. They don't even try. So this is what people who have looked at cases of individuals, women who fail to leave, very severe violence. Why don't they leave? This is what they're talking about, learned helplessness. Oops. And there's a sad little puppy. Okay. Anyway, the cycle of abuse, okay, is this idea, this is Leonore Walker suggested this, is that over time there's escalation, and certainly in that video clip you heard the woman talk about it's going to get worse. Right? It's likely not to stop. So the first time, early in the relationship, is not that severe. Then there is what's one called, this is a tension phase as you're going up. Right, there's tension in the home. Okay, the red reflects the actual assault that occurs. Then often there's a justification phase. There's also calm in the home. This is very reinforcing both for the victim and the perpetrator. Okay, and then there's a remission phase when everything's going okay. Okay? So it's not this case that in domestic violence is constant 24 hours a day abuse, right? It's episodic. Okay? And typically what happens, and this is not always the case, but typically what happens is that it escalates in severity in terms of what happens. It may start with verbal abusive behavior, minor violence, up into more extreme forms of violence, maybe moving into sexual violence. And the time of remission disappears, so that it becomes more frequent. Okay? Often as well, the justification phase, initially, the person will apologize. Say they're sorry, I didn't mean to do it, I don't know what happened to me, I'll never do it again. Right? And then over time, they stop apologizing. Okay? Factors related to leaving, change in frequency, severity, or direction of the abuse. So if you start getting beaten up once a week, you get, a knife is used, right? Or you're being threatened with a gun. Or if the partner starts directing the abuse to an animal in the home or the children. Right? So some woman will say, I can handle the abuse. I'm willing to take it. But if he starts abusing the kids or the pets, that's when I'm leaving. Change in resources. Someone mentioned this Worth program over in England. So there's a new pilot program to support women who have been domestically abused. So if you get a new job, or get a friend who's supportive, or a shelter opens up near where you're living, all of that can trigger someone to decide to leave. I mentioned the decrease in express remorse. Right? You might stay with someone because they say, I'm really sorry, I won't do it again. When they stop saying, I'm sorry, after you being beaten, you realize they don't even feel anything for me, so I might as well leave. And change in visibility of the violence, so they start beating you in front of your children, beating you in front of your friends, or out on the street. That might trigger, because then you think, this guy won't be inhibited at all. Holly Johnson, who works at Stats Canada, did a study asking women why they returned. So these were a set of women who actually left their abusive partners. So they left. 70% actually returned. So they'd gotten out of the situation, right? And then they turned back and went back to live with their abusive partner. So lack of resources, 1 in 10, right? How am I going to find an apartment? I have no money, all that sort of thing. Husband promised to change, so the husband got in touch with them, said, I'm going to change this time. I'll go to counseling with you or whatever. Right? I promise you I'll change. They wanted to give the relationship another chance. Right? They missed their husband when they moved into the shelter. They transition home. They wanted to go back. Certainly, like you mentioned, a lot of them talk about for the sake of the children. Right? Now, I'm assuming for the sake of the children, or those circumstances where the children weren't being abused, that they were being abused, and they want their children to have a father. Right? Maybe that's not the best father, but at least the children have a father. And 1 in 5 of them talked about threats of violence. So somehow, even though they're at a shelter or transition house, they heard that their husband was out to get them. Right? That they would be, threats that they would do something to them if they could find them. So they decided, well, again, it would be better if I go back to live with him other than having him threaten my family members or others. There's been a lot of research on typologies of male batterers. Very little research on typologies of female batterers. About 25% are antisocial. These are individuals who are antisocial in the community as well. Okay, so these individuals, when you get to talking about psychopathy, these are the psychopathic batterers. Okay, so they have many risk factors. Typically, they engage in other criminal behavior as well as domestic violence. They have good self-esteem, no problem with their sense of self-worth. It's not because they're dependent on their wife. No problems with depression or anxiety or anything like that. Okay? So these are probably going to be the most difficult individuals to treat. Okay? 25% of what's called the dysphoric borderline male batterers. These are individuals who direct their violence only towards their partner. Okay? Often they're very dependent on their partner for their sense of self-worth. They don't have many friends outside their relationships. They are very jealous and possessive of their partner. Okay, so what will trigger them? They think their partner is looking at someone else, right, paying attention to someone else. Often these dysphoric borderline individuals have high rates of depression, anxiety, so they have whole other comorbid symptoms as well. And then the 50% are family only as well, so they don't do it outside the family. These individuals really are very low self-esteem. All this sense of self-esteem comes from being with their partner. So when their partner makes threats to leave, right, this really threatens their self-esteem. So that's the largest group. Okay? So certainly there are obviously different types of males who batter. Now you don't have this graph in your book. This is called the ecological model of family violence. It's a model that's been put forward by the World Health Organization. Basically, it's saying that when you're looking at risk factors, and this is true for risk factors for child abuse or violence in general, you need to look at within the individual. Okay, so within the individual, things like young age, low socioeconomic status, being exposed to domestic violence as a child, levels of anger, hostility, dependency, depression. So the individual is what's within the individual engaging in, right, the violence. Then the next level is what's happening within the relationship. Right? So if you have a relationship where there's lots of conflict, poor communication skills between the man and the wife, that will obviously relate in higher rates or be a risk factor for violence. Then you can look at the next level would be the community, the family, the friends of the couple. What's happening in terms of the community, in terms of does this individual has friends who are supportive of the use of violence? And then you can look at the societal level. Are there norms supportive of violence in the society? Are there resources for individuals or not? Because we know if there are resources, some woman will then leave the relationship. Okay, so theories of spousal assault. I'm going to talk to you about two. There's a societal level, a big broad-based theory. Sometimes it's called the feminist theory of spousal assault. Basically, it's a belief that there is unequal distribution of power, status, control, authority in society, and that the unequal status that men have more of this than women, and that wife assault basically occurs because woman challenges or violates the cultural norms. Okay, these patriarchal beliefs that men should be in control and dominant in society, and then what happens, a woman may want to challenge these attitudes, values, and beliefs, and that's what results in the violence. This was primarily developed by, as I say, feminists many, many years ago. The Duluth model is a treatment program developed based on this belief. You'll see this power and control wheel all over the place, right? So that in the center is this idea that domestic violence or spousal violence is simply solely due to power and control, right? And then all these spokes of the wheel will, using intimidation, using economic abuse, male privilege, using children, is all manifestations of trying to control women. Okay? And then they have a treatment model and it's called the Duluth treatment model, where you're going to confront and challenge men's belief that it's okay to dominate and control. I'm not really spending enough time on this, but anyway, this model and the treatment that goes with it, certainly there's some evidence that it's successful for some individuals, and it probably is somewhat successful for those individuals who believe in this, these men, but this is not going to explain everyone's use of violence. Any problems? I don't think, hopefully you may agree or disagree, I don't think there is a cultural norm supportive of violence in Canada. Right? So certainly if you ask people, is it all right for someone to hit their partner, vast majority of individuals say no, it's not. This is not okay to hit anyone. Men who batter, even those men who do engage in this behavior, will admit that it's not acceptable. They don't think they have this privilege to dominate and control. Okay, so they realize what they're doing is typically wrong. The vast majority of men are not violent. So if there's some sort of cultural, patriarchal beliefs, it's only affecting a few people in society. And we have to also, any theory should explain all use of violence. And we already know women use violence at equal amount to men. So if you have a theory, it should be able to explain both men and women's use of violence. They should be able to explain same-sex violence, in heterosexual and same-sex relationships. I'm going to go through at least through social learning theory before we stop the class, because this has certainly been a theory that's where the cognitive behavioral treatment programs have focused on. So Bandura's theory has been applied to a whole bunch of different areas. It certainly has been applied to spousal violence. So it assumes that violence is learned. Okay, so this is the cognitive behavioral model. You learn to use violence. And there's three different components. One, the major source of learning is observational learning. So you grow up in a family, right? You will model the behavior and how your parents resolve conflict. You're going to model that behavior. And certainly there is evidence that if you view or you experience exposure to domestic violence as a child, you're 3 times more likely to engage in this as an adult. Okay, so this is you watching your parents resolve conflict. It's not surprising you learn this. Exposure to violence outside the family. So this is also observational learning. You're watching TV shows where violence results in success. You're playing video games, movies, etc. And the research has shown that when kids engage in this, right, watching these TV shows, they tend to be desensitized to violence, and it alters their restraints about using violence. There's some really neat observational studies about how kids act on recess, and then linking them to amount of televised violence they look at. Okay, so that's the first component. So I asked you on a quiz about the first component of social, or I won't ask you on the quiz, on the final social learning theory. The first component is the observational learning, right? The source. Now I watched violent TV, and I didn't play violent video games, but you know, I probably saw some movies that were violent. But do I engage in violence? So I could learn to use violence, right, because I've observed it, but I might not use it. You need to have some sort of instigator. So the second component of social learning theory is instigation. So unless there's an appropriate trigger in the environment, you certainly know how to use violence, but you may not use it. So there can be aversive instigators, something that gets you upset. Okay? So there's something, you come home from work, something pisses you off, your spouse says something that annoys you or nags you or whatever. You feel that event or you perceive that event as aversive, negative. That causes your arousal level to increase. Then you need to label the arousal. And there's research by Gondoff saying that men who abuse have what's called the male emotional funnel. Okay? So there's a whole list of emotions, stress, anxiety, depression, etc. They have these feelings, but they label these feelings as anger and hostility. So they don't discriminate between different emotions. Okay? So then they label this as anxiety, jealousy, angry, that they're angered. They could then either withdraw from the situation or engage in aggression. Okay? There's also incentive instigators, nothing to do about a specific event. You simply want to control others. So there, yes, power control is an important issue here. Right? You can get someone to do something that you want. That's incentive for you. Okay? And the last component of social learning theory is what's called regulators. So a behavior is regulated by its consequences. Right? You saw the little doggies jumping over the gate. Right? Their behavior was regulated by the consequences they received. If there's positive outcome by engaging in aggression and violence, you get something positive. Right? It reduces the tension you feel, your anxiety, your feelings of anger, it reduces. because you've controlled someone, you got them to do something he wanted, right? If you regain feeling that you're in control, you might not be in control at work, you might not be very much in control in society, but at home you can control the situation. So that's going to be a positive feeling, right? So positive feelings and outcomes are going to increase the use of violence. Negative outcomes, if the consequences, so regulators are basically talking about consequences, negative outcomes are going to decrease violence. So if you feel, now I'm talking about self-punishment, if you feel upset, remorse, or guilt about your behavior, and it's genuine, that's going to inhibit you from engaging in future acts. If you think that there are going to be legal sanctions, the police are going to come, you're going to be arrested, your boss is going to find out that you beat your wife or your girlfriend, those are going to be social and legal sanctions. They're going to be negative for you, so you're going to then decrease your violence. Okay, so there's 3 components to think about in terms of social learning theory. Okay, we'll see you on Wednesday. Okay, we're ready to get started. I forgot to open up the last assignment to you. That's the feedback about the course. There's only 18 items, so I encourage you to go ahead and do the feedback. I realize most of you probably have your 4 bonus marks. But again, if you want to give feedback, that's available. The quiz is up, so you should be able to access the quiz right now. I think that's about it. So this is our last guest lecturer. I kept the best to the last. This is Professor Kevin Nunes. He works here in the psychology department. He is the other instructor of 2400. So if you weren't in this course, you probably would be with either Kevin or actually we do have Kim O'Neill as well. Kevin works in the area of sexual offenders, so that's why I asked him to come in and give this lecture. So this is his area of expertise. And he's going to be talking about sex offenders. Is there anything I need to add?
That's it.
He's a good guy. Okay,
Thanks.
Here he is.
Thanks, Adele. Good morning, everybody. So, yeah, I've been here for, I guess it's been about 3 or 4 years now, and I've been working on this sort of stuff for, I guess it's been about 10 years, almost. Yeah, no, actually a little over 10 years. Started at 1998 at University of Ottawa, working with Phil Firestone, doing research on this sort of stuff, and been going in that general direction ever since. So in my lab, we do a lot of work in this area. We also do work in sort of general aggression and things like that. So today, I'm going to sort of give you a really streamlined, quick, sort of bare bones kind of sex offenders 101, everything that you may or may not want to know about sex offenders or may need to know about sex offenders in terms of getting a sense of what's out there, the knowledge that we have, some of the issues and things like that. And hopefully some of the stuff that touches on some information in your book. We won't really talk about some of the typologies and Finkelhorst theories and some of the other things that are in there. Those are important, but just in the interest of time, I chose to focus on some other stuff. You have those in your book, and hopefully that'll get you that information. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, the plan is to talk about initiation or etiology. You know, why do some people do this sort of thing? Recidivism, reoffending, right? So how do we know how many people are reoffending? How do we know who's reoffending? How do we know who's likely to reoffend? Risk assessment, how do we assess, you know, get a sense of, again, who's likely to reoffend, what their probability of that is, what kind of targets can be worked on to reduce that risk, and ties nicely into treatment. What kind of things can be done to try to reduce risk that offenders pose? Okay, so why do you think some people would commit sex offenses? Why do you think some people would choose to sexually abuse a child? Why do you think some people would choose to sexually assault an adult? Yeah? Maybe they were assaulted themselves as a child? Okay. Sounds good. I'm actually going to turn this mic down a little bit. I feel like I'm feeding back here. I hope that's okay. I just turn it down a touch. Okay, so maybe they were sexually assaulted themselves, sexually abused themselves, and that may lead them to offend. Okay. Any other sort of explanations, whether they're just your own hunches or they're sort of facts that you know from various sources? You guys seem to have an idea there. I hear you chatting. You guys have an idea about why that might happen? No? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah? A weird fetish, so sort of a sexual preference, just like people are interested in certain groups or certain genders or ages. They might have certain interest for either, say, aggressive rape type sexuality, sex, or children or something like that. Okay, so just sort of that's their interest. That's what they kind of like, just like you guys like whatever it is you like. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe like a psychological disorder. We don't understand the difference of what is appropriate and what is not.
Okay, so just aren't able to sort of appreciate that what they're doing or what they want to do is wrong, almost kind of thing. So they just sort of out of touch with reality in some way or something like that, and doing this thing that's harmful, but they don't really notice that or know that. Okay. Did I see another hand up? No? Okay. All right, so there's all kinds of reasons that are raised. There's all kinds of reasons that are mentioned in theory. Again, some of those theories are talked about in your textbook. Some of the things you guys mentioned are, have been sort of grabbed by other people and implicated, in why people sort of do this thing in the first place. This is sort of a hodgepodge of theories that are out there, sort of grabbed, I guess, three main avenues or approaches. This isn't really any one theory up at the top. It's kind of, as I said, sort of a hodgepodge of things by Bill Marshall. You see some of the Finkelhor kind of ideas in there that are in your textbook, the idea of blockage and some other ideas. But I think it captures this sort of, I guess, the flavor of theories like this and explanations like this of why some people commit these kind of offenses. Typically you're looking at sort of vulnerability. People are vulnerable in some way, and then they start doing these kind of offenses as a way to try to, I guess, cope with their situation, a way to try to get their needs met, albeit in a bad way. Okay, so the typical sort of trajectory usually starts out with negative childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, right? This would lead somebody to insecure attachment, so sort of a weak relationship with their parents, for example. So bad relationship with your mother, for example, sort of would give you a frame that you might then take out into the world to deal with other people in your other relationships with friends, romantic partners, whatever the case may be, right? So if that's a strong, loving, supportive, kind of trusting kind of relationship, then that's probably a good template that you would take out to the world with you. Whereas if it's, neglectful or even worse, a harmful, scary relationship, then that probably doesn't bode all that well if that's a template you take out to the world where you're very, not trusting other people and viewing other people as hostile and dangerous and scary. Sort of I'll get them before they get me kind of, mindset perhaps. Moving to low self-confidence. So again, this all sort of makes sense, right? You have somebody's negative childhood experiences, sort of insecure attachment. They're not feeling very good about themselves. They don't feel very confident. They move into puberty, right? So this is typically aimed at sort of young boys. Most of these sort of models move into puberty. They don't really have the social skills or the regulation to manage relationships, to secure, nice, pro-social, happy kind of relationships, dating, you know, teenagers, that things would do, going to the movies with each other, whatever it is that kids do nowadays, and having these nice sort of relationships with the, you know, presumably with the other sex, but not necessarily. It could be whoever they're interested in, right? But appropriate, age-appropriate partners. But they don't have the social skills, they don't have the confidence, right? They're not able to sort of secure these kind of relationships, so they're blocked from appropriate sexual and emotional partners. And then you may see the development of deviant sexual interests and attitudes supportive of offending, and then finally leading to either sexual abuse of children or sexual assault. Okay, so again, the different models will vary a little bit, but this is one sort of prototypical kind of trajectory or pathway that's often depicted and talked about. Some of the key things to keep in mind with these kind of theories, as with any models that we talk about, you know, none of these things are one-to-one, right? We all know people who have had terrible childhoods. We all know people that maybe aren't that confident. We all know people that maybe don't have that much success with romantic relationships and things like that, right? Most of them undoubtedly do not sexually offend, right? Either against children or against other adults, okay? So certainly none of these things, you know, predetermine or you know, make it so that somebody is definitely going to end up doing these kind of things. Nobody's suggesting that. The authors of these theories aren't, I'm not, and I think just common sense, you know, sort of indicates that we wouldn't expect that. Some other theories that are not necessarily at odds with any of these, but have a very different flavor to them, are this idea of sort of neurodevelopmental problems, things that happen, you know, even before birth, early childhood, that result in brain damage or brain problems, essentially, that can then put someone sort of on a path where they're more likely to develop some of these different sexual interests, perhaps. It might perturb their sexual preferences, their sexual interests. It might also perturb their empathy, their ability to communicate with others, to get along in the world, to succeed in pro-social ways. Okay, so you might see something, you know, there are sort of some theories suggesting that pedophilia may be a result of early brain damage, as I was saying. There's all kinds of research out there showing that people with pedophilic interests, so people that are interested in children, right? When I was talking about pedophilia, I think everybody knows that. I think it's a common term, but talking about a sexual preference for children or a strong sexual interest in children. They have sort of evidence of developmental problems. I'm sad to say, as a short guy, that they're often shorter. Other things, they're less intelligent than people with sexual interest in adults. There's all kinds of differences between pedophilic men and people that have sexual interest in adults that do sort of not necessarily prove this neurodevelopmental problem pathway, but you know, are consistent with that idea. That there are a number of markers that suggest not necessarily that the low intelligence causes the sexual offending, but that something that sort of messed up their intelligence along the way may also be, you know, perturbing their sexual interests and their sexual behavior. Another interesting perspective that sometimes, well, is often, I think it's controversial, and I think a lot of people that hear it think it's controversial, and some people take it the wrong way, I guess. But I like to mention it because it is, I think it's a valid perspective and a really interesting one on this, and a very different one, I think, than most of us would think of on our own. So I think that top stuff, you know, I think that sort of fits. I don't know if you like that one, but I would imagine that that's probably more consistent with the way most people might think about offending and why people offend. You know, they have a rough start, things don't go well, and they sort of get lost along the way and end up offending. In contrast, from an evolutionary perspective, specifically for sexual assault, the suggestion is very different. It's not that sort of somebody got lost along the way and couldn't make it necessarily and made some mistakes. It's actually, for some men, suggestion that sexual assault may have been adaptive in our historical environments. Okay, and what do we mean by adaptive? What do we mean by historical environments? These are really important things to consider. Well, adaptive, all we mean by that from an evolutionary perspective is simply that it may have resulted in more offspring that then had more offspring, that then had more offspring, right? Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad either. It just means adaptive is something that basically promotes your genes, you know, and carries them through time. Okay, so anything that you do that results in more successful offspring will mean that your genetic material should be, and whatever characteristics go along with that, right? Whatever heritable characteristics that are part of your genetic makeup should become more common as time goes on, right? Whereas things that lead us not to reproduce should sort of die out, right, or become less common. Okay. What does the research say on initiation? So we talked about some theoretical perspectives. I don't really have a lot of time here, so I really am just going to give you some of the highlights. There's all kinds of other stuff, though. It's a huge field, all kinds of research on this stuff, really interesting stuff. But some of the key variables that are talked about and have been looked at, or that are thought to be important, deviant sexual interests, as we talked about, right? Somebody mentioned that. That's a big one. That kind of makes sense, right? Why would somebody want to do something like this? Well, maybe they like it. Maybe it turns them on, right? Maybe it's exciting for them. Makes sense. Does the evidence support that? Well, yeah, it does seem to support that. When you compare child molesters to other people, so people that have sexually offended against children compared to people that haven't, so they might also be in jail, they might also have been processed by the courts, right, or arrested in some way. So compared to people that are offenders of some sort but haven't committed sex offenses, typically you'll see more interest in children among the child molesters than among the comparison groups. Same with non-offenders, people that haven't committed any crimes. Right? So they do tend to show more interest in children. And that can be measured in a number of ways. There's some kind of interesting and weird ways that that's measured. Often they'll do something called penile plethysmography or phallometric testing, which essentially involves sort of strapping a little rubber band essentially onto somebody's penis and then watching what they get aroused to. So you might show them pictures. If I were showing you pictures up here of, say, Angelina Jolie or Jessica Alba or whoever it is that you happen to like, and I monitor your arousal to that, and then I show you pictures of, Brad Pitt or whoever else, whatever it is, and monitor your arousal to that, and then I might show you pictures of a goat or pictures of a chicken or something like that, and if I saw that people were getting more aroused to the pictures of the goat or the chicken, then that would tell me something, about what you like compared to what you don't like. And sometimes they'll use audio stories and all kinds of things. There's a whole number of ways that these kind of interests are assessed. That's just one of them, and that's sort of the most obvious one, right? If you want to see what turns someone on, well, let's see what turns them on, right? That makes sense. But there's all kinds of other things like viewing time. How long do people look at pictures of certain things? Do you look at the picture of the chicken more than you look at the picture of Jessica or Brad or whoever, right? We can get a sense of what you're more interested in, and there's, again, a whole number of ways that those things are looked at that actually is a pretty interesting literature and research area. What about rapists? So child molesters, the stuff's pretty clear. On average, so not all child molesters prefer children, right? Not all child molesters are pedophilic, but on average, child molesters do show more interest in children than the average person who doesn't do that kind of thing, as far as we know, right? Makes sense. Rapists, there's quite a bit of debate about whether this is the case for rapists, but the evidence overall shows that, yeah, it does seem to be that way. Rapists, similarly, seem to show more arousal to rape than do non-rapists, than people that don't commit rape or haven't committed rape. Okay, this is, again, it's sort of a debated area. People disagree about why this might be. One of the, I think, the most plausible explanations for most rapists is, why are you seeing this greater arousal and what does it mean? Well, for most rapists, it seems that what's happening is the violence isn't inhibiting their arousal, right? So for most men, sexual contact with a desired partner is interesting and fun and exciting to the extent that that partner is not suffering, right? Once the suffering of the partner or harm to the partner is introduced to the story, it suddenly becomes not very fun anymore, right? Obviously not fun for the victim, but also not fun for the person who might be involved or listening to a story about that, right? Most men don't like that. That kind of wrecks things, right? Thankfully, that's good. But for rapists, it seems like they don't have that sort of shut-off, right? Or have it less than, normal men or non-rapists. Right? So it's not necessarily that they love violence or are really turned on by violence or have a fetish for violence, but it seems that for most rapists what may be going on is just that they don't really care if there's violence. It doesn't wreck it. It doesn't bother them. It doesn't wreck the mood. It's not a deal breaker. It's not a problem. They can be just as aroused if the victim is suffering and there's physical aggression as if it's consenting. Okay, so that's not all rapists. Certainly some do seem to be quite sadistic and get really turned on and aroused and like the violence and the suffering of the victim, and that's the thing for them. But on average, for the majority of rapists, it seems to be more this sort of thing. This greater arousal seems to be explained by this failure of the violence to sort of turn them off like it would with normal men, rather than them having a real turn on for violence specifically. Childhood sexual abuse, again, that's one that was mentioned. That's a big one. Everybody talks about that. Everybody thinks it's important, and I think it makes sense from a modeling perspective and all kinds of other perspectives. It's appealing intuitively. What does the evidence say about that? I've always been skeptical about this one. You know, again, it seems like a good story. My sense has always been, looking at the individual studies, that maybe it's not such an important factor and there's not such big differences. Although you might find, yes, that sex offenders have higher rates of abuse than, say, a group of students or a group of people in the community. If you compare them to people that have had sort of similarly rough lives, you know, say other offenders that haven't committed sex offenses, you know, I expected you wouldn't find differences. But thankfully, and again, highlighting the importance of meta-analysis, right, as opposed to narrative reviews and eyeballing the literature, a couple of recent a few recent meta-analyses actually on adults, on juveniles, and sort of similar one on adults as well, have found, yeah, pretty consistently, sex offenders have higher rates of child sexual abuse than non-sex offenders. It's a big finding, it's a big difference. The rates are on average, not every study finds that, but on average, and in most studies, there's a large difference in the rates of child sexual abuse that's been experienced when you look at child molesters or sex offenders in general compared to people that haven't committed sex offenses. What might be happening there? What might mediate the relationship between child sexual abuse and offending? Could be anything. But let's just assume, in this research it's kind of hard to tell if there's a causal influence there, because it is sort of correlational kind of research, observational kind of research, but let's just assume that maybe there is a causal link there, that for some individuals, for some reason, if they're abused, you know, and there may be certain types of abuse or something about them, some sort of vulnerability that interacts with that, but for some reason, if this is influencing and leading some of these people to go on and commit offenses themselves, why is that? What avenue might that be working through? Well, one suggestion from the literature is child sexual abuse seems to be associated with greater sexual attraction among child molesters. So if you look at child molesters that have been sexually abused themselves compared to child molesters that have not been abused, you'll see greater interest in children among the abused child molesters. Okay, so perhaps, you know, maybe there's an influence through there. Maybe somehow it perturbs their sexual preferences or their sexual interests in the developmental process and makes them more vulnerable or more likely to develop interest themselves in children, perhaps. And of course, this isn't to say that people that are abused are pedophilic, right? A lot of people are sexually, you know, sadly, a lot of people are victimized or sexually victimized as children. Again, certainly the majority don't go on to commit sex offenses, right? I mean, there's no question. Compared to the rates you see out there, most people aren't doing this. You'll see, you know, higher rates of abuse among women, among like girls than boys. And again, who are the most likely offenders? Men by far, right? I haven't reported those rates here, but I think intuitively, and certainly the evidence supports that men are usually overrepresented among the abusers compared to women. So certainly in no way suggesting that there's a one-to-one relationship that abuse leads people to become child molesters or become pedophilic. But among those who do that sort of thing, again, you do see higher rates of abuse than among those who don't. So it's probably a fairly complex relationship, but this is kind of interesting to speculate about some of the mediators that might be involved. If the abuse does have a causal influence, what it might be affecting, and that might in turn be leading people to offend. Oh, I should mention too, if you're skeptical like me, you might be thinking, yeah, come on, it's just because the sex offenders know that they're supposed to say, you know, it's a good story, right? You know, oh yeah, I did this because I was abused myself, right? It's probably a sympathetic story. It might sound good. It might make people, you know, treat you a little nicer or feel sorry for you or somehow excuse what you've done, right? So that seems like a plausible explanation for the higher rates. They might just be saying it happened more, right? But in these meta-analyses, at least in a couple of them anyway, They looked at not only self-reported abuse, but they also looked at abuse that was coded from other sources, so like official things, child support services, for example, records, official records, hospital records, for example. Okay, so from a number of other sources, not just the person saying, you know, did this ever happen to you? Yes, no. Right? It's actually from other official sources earlier in time, and they found the same pattern of results. Okay, so you still see these higher rates of abuse among the sex offenders than the non-sex offenders. What about psychopathy? I'm sure you know everything about psychopathy. Oh, no, you haven't talked about it yet next week? Okay. So a little teaser then. You hear a little bit about psychopathy, but not much. So what is psychopathy? I'm glad I included this then, if you haven't been talking about that at all yet, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, right? Generally, an arrogant, deceitful interpersonal style, deficient affective experiences, impulsive and irresponsible behavior, and early onset and diverse antisocial behaviors. So often, you know, generally thought of as a personality disorder, right? As you can see from those descriptions, you'd expect that it'd be, you know, associated with crime, violence, hurting people, taking advantage of people. So, you know, I think a lot of people think, well, if somebody's going to do this kind of stuff, they must be a psychopath, right? How could anybody do this to somebody if they even remotely had any empathy, any, you know, any caring, any human sort of qualities, human warmth, right? How could they do this to somebody? And the results, I don't think they're that surprising sort of once you get a better sense of what some of the offenders are like, but they might be surprising to some of you. For child molesters, CMs, when you see that there, it's just a shorthand for child molesters, just so I can fit more on the slide. Child molesters actually are less psychopathic on average than rapists and than non-sexual violent offenders. So that might be surprising. You might think, well, if somebody's going to do that to a child, they must be, you know, how could they do that, right? But the reasons they may do that, psychopathy doesn't seem to be a big factor for most, right, on average. So there are certainly very psychopathic child molesters. Adele sometimes talks about one case, Kruger is it, that you talk about, and certainly there are a number of others, so they're out there. It's not to say they're not, but on average, they're lower on psychopathy than rapists and sort of generally violent kind of offenders. What about rapists? Well, rapists seem to be generally similar to other kinds of violent offenders. Heterosocial competence is a big one. I think we talked about that. I don't know if somebody mentioned that, the idea of social skills, social ability. We talked about that certainly in the general theory stuff. You know, why might somebody do this? Well, they might be blocked from offending, right? Blocked from relationships, rather. They might be blocked from pro-social partners. They can't achieve that. Maybe they're too shy. Maybe they're too awkward or just, you know, socially incompetent or scared or whatever the case may be. Clearly that's a big part of things, right? If somebody, the more socially competent somebody is, the more, you know, the easier it will be for them to secure desirable and partners that they're satisfied with and happy with and can have good relationships with. Makes sense? So maybe somebody can't do that and then they say turn to children because they can't relate to adults and can't talk to anybody. So they just turn to children as sort of a second option, not their preferred option, but just, you know, I have nothing else to do here, maybe I'll try this or something, right? To try to get their needs met, to try to sexually, emotionally, those kind of things. Or maybe they'll turn to sexual assault, you know, trying to say, okay, well, again, I can't talk to women, I can't ask a woman out, but you don't have to be socially competent to sexually assault someone, right? So are these things important? Well, they seem to be related to child sexual abuse. So child molesters do show less heterosocial competence than do non-sex offenders, rapists, and non-offenders. But rapists, contrary to what a lot of speculation you'll see in the literature, and maybe our own intuition, rapists don't actually seem to be less socially competent than other kinds of offenders that haven't committed sex offenses. But they do seem to be less socially competent than people like you, a bunch of non-offenders. And again, some of this stuff sort of highlights, I guess, the heterogeneity of offenders. We're talking about really broad distinctions, right, based on the age of the victims that they offend against. But, you know, obviously there's all kinds of other nuances and differences between them. And this just sort of is one, I guess, one opportunity to highlight that, I guess, that you can see how for some groups this seems to be related, for other groups it's not. And so it goes. If you look at different kinds of child molesters, different kinds of rapists, you may see different sort of relationships, different characteristics, and presumably different influences on their behavior and different motivations for why they do what they do. Okay, what about beliefs? Beliefs, attitudes, values, all that kind of stuff, it's huge in this area. Treatment spends most of its time addressing these sort of things, trying to work on what people think. And that makes sense, I think, right? You know, what you think is probably related to what you do, you'd think, right? So in treatment, they spend an awful lot of time talking about, you know, the way people think about their offenses, the way they think about women, the way they think about children, the way they think about themselves, and trying to work on that and improve that so that they can sort of have a less pro-offending kind of view on things. So some of the biggies that are talked about are things like what's often called cognitive distortions, you know, beliefs about children. Typically, there's sort of another synonym, I guess, is belief supportive of sex offending. So we have belief supportive of sex offending against children, and we have belief supportive of sex offending against adults. Sort of have these two streams of things. Generally, those kind of beliefs for children would be things like believing that children are sexually motivated, and that children are interested in having sex with adults or sexual contact with adults. Right? So a lot of these items, if you look at these kind of, they're usually self-report scales, right? And they'll ask you things like, you know, if a child sits on your lap, that means the child wants to have sex with you. If a child comes into the washroom while you're going to the washroom, that means they want to see you naked or something like that. So kind of questions that clearly suggest that the children are sort of almost making a move, right? The children are seductive, the children are interested in this sort of thing, as opposed to just innocent, you know, things that kids would do. On these kind of scales, child molesters do endorse these kind of beliefs more so than non-sex offenders, than rapists and non-offenders. Pretty consistent, pretty big effects across the board. Interestingly, they're not overwhelmingly supportive. It's not like they're sort of, you know, rah, yes, definitely, this is true. Children are seductive. Children are interested in sex with adults, right? They're not sort of over the top endorsing these things, but they just sort of disagree with these things less than people who don't do those sort of things, right? So for most of you, if I gave you those surveys, most people are, you know, never, no, right? Everybody's extremely like, no, children never are interested in sex with adults. No, children are never being seductive. No, you know. So we're all very clear and very extreme in our beliefs about that sort of thing. But the child molesters, on average, it's not that they are on the other pole. It's just that they're sort of, you know, saying, yeah, well, maybe a little, maybe that's possible, you know. So they're just disagreeing less strongly than non-sex offenders would. Other beliefs about women, sometimes called rape myths, again, cognitive distortions, beliefs supportive of rape, all those kind of things. Generally, believing that women deserve or are complicit in rape sort of captures the themes in most of those sort of scales and most of those constructs. So those kind of things are, you know, some women, if women are dressed a certain way, they're asking for sexual assault. You know, if women are sexually promiscuous, they're more deserving somehow of, or you know, open themselves up to sexual assault, things like that. Stereotypes about victims, all kinds of things like that, sort of minimizing the harm. You know, rape doesn't harm people that much. Same thing with a child molestation. Doesn't, you know, it's not that harmful, right? These are all the kind of distorted sort of beliefs that you'd expect would support offending. So what kind of differences do you see on those scales? Well, rapists typically endorse these kind of beliefs about women more so than non-sex offenders. Makes sense. Hostility to women is a big one as well. This comes up in a number of theories on sexual assault, Malamuth's and other people's theories. Rapists, as you might expect, are more hostile towards women than non-offenders generally. Okay, and all these things kind of make sense, right? If you believe these things, you know, intuitively, this fits, right? We would imagine that somebody's endorsing these kind of beliefs, they're then more likely to do these kind of things, right? If you think something's okay, you're probably more likely to do it than if you think it's terrible and horrible, right? Makes sense. Similarly, with hostility towards women, if you have sort of devalued a group, right, dehumanized a group, you hate this group or are really angry at this group, maybe it's easier to harm that group or to view them as deserving of harm. Right? So all these things sort of, certainly from an intuitive perspective, and with the theories that are behind them, do make sense and fit nicely. Okay, what about recidivism? So recidivism, reoffending, the research on theory and initiation sort of pales by comparison to the sexual recidivism research. Sexual recidivism is big because people have to answer to this sort of thing, right? So if you're a politician, if you're a parole officer, if you're a psychologist, if you're the parole board, right, all these sort of things, you get in trouble usually when sex offenders sexually reoffend. Right? Especially if it's on your watch, right? If it happens on your watch, then okay, you're not going to get in trouble. But if it happens on your watch, if you're the person that decided to let that guy go on parole because you thought he was safe, and then he reoffends, you're in big trouble, right? At the very least, you feel very bad, and perhaps other external sort of consequences you're going to have to deal with. Whereas for the initiation stuff, although I think it's very important, I think it's the most interesting question. Why are people doing this, right? I think that's a really fascinating question. But compared to those ones, this one has sort of more tangible, I think, consequences for policy, for politics, for agencies. Okay. So there's a lot of research that's been done on this, and particularly on risk assessment. What are the rates of sexual recidivism? I don't know what you have in your head, but I would bet if you don't know a lot about this area that you would think the rates are that these are surprisingly low to you. Certainly when you hear politicians speak, when you hear media, and you hear just generally talking to people, there seems to be a perception that sexual recidivism is almost guaranteed for most sex offenders. Anybody sort of feel that way or heard that kind of sentiment? Nobody? You're all enlightened and liberal? Okay. Well, the people I hang out with think that all sex offenders are destined to reoffend. It's just a matter of time. So what do the rates of reoffending look like? Well, I mean, how do we measure reoffending? That's sort of the first issue. And that's a challenge, right? Because as you probably know from your other sections that you covered in the course, a lot of people commit a lot of crimes that they never get caught for, never get arrested for, never get charged with, never get convicted of, and never go to jail for, right? A lot of crimes happen. And certainly sex offenses compared to other kinds of offenses are much less reported, right? The rates of reporting to police, for example, are much lower for sex offenses, even compared to other kinds of violent crime. Right? So some crimes, not all crimes get reported, that's clear, but for sex offenses it seems to be especially the case. Okay, so clearly there's a lot of crime going on that we don't know about, a lot of sex offenses going on that we aren't going to hear about and be able to detect through official sources. So that's a bit of a problem. But by the same token, you would think that if somebody's offending and they're offending a lot, eventually they're going to get caught. You'd think we'd see those rates showing up, right? We'll see get some sense. It's going to be an underestimate for sure. But how much of an underestimate is debatable depending on, how likely people are to get caught if they sort of persist and keep offending. So keep in mind that these are official rates. These are based on arrests, okay? So they're going to underestimate how many people actually offended. But even still, even keeping that in mind, even knowing that, right? These rates are very low. And I think even if I asked you what you expected the official rates to be, you would think most of you would assume they'd be much higher than this. So this is from a meta-analysis in 2004, looked at a number of studies, all the studies they could find on recidivism and predictors of sexual recidivism, or more accurately, predictors of recidivism among sex offenders. And averaging the rates across all those studies, the follow-up time was about 5 to 6 years, so that's a pretty long time, right? That's from release. If the guy's released, today, 5 or 6 years out of these 1,000 or however many guys have been released, what proportion of them end up getting a new sexual offense, arrest, charge, conviction, that sort of stuff. So for sexual recidivism, 14%. Okay, not 100%, 14%. Non-sexual violent, assault, beating somebody up, right, shooting someone, not in a sexual sort of not a sex offense, just a regular violent offense. Any violence, so whether it be sexual, whether they sexually assault someone or they punch someone in the face or do whatever, right? Any violence. And any would just be any, steal a pack of gum, steal a car, burn down a building, sexually assault someone, shoot someone, all those things would go into any, as the name suggests. So you can see the rates overall are pretty low, 37% for any kind of offending. And as we work our way up to more extreme sort of offending, any violence, 25%. Okay? So again, the rates are, I think, lower than most people would expect. But regardless of what you expect, the official rates, and that's usually all we have to go on and all we have to work our policies around and develop, ways we're going to deal with these sort of things, are fairly low, right? So that has implications for how we deal with offenders, how we deal with sex offenders. Yes?
The sexual rate being so low, would you say that most offenders know that what they're doing is wrong, and that's why they stop? Or does that comparatively, would they stop because they don't get caught?
It's a really good question. I would think it's so low just because it's a fairly low base rate event to begin with. I mean, again, it's always sort of conflicting, right? It happens a lot, but it's still, and it happens too much, but it's still a fairly low base rate event in the big scheme of things in terms of what happens every day to people typically. So I think it's just sort of a rare, I think it's just a rare event. Not as rare as we'd like, but I think it's more rare than we sometimes think. And for those that do tend to persisting in it, I think once they're punished, perhaps they just sort of, they stop doing that. Or, I guess the alternate explanation is that they do it smarter so they don't get caught. And it's certainly a possibility, but I don't think it explains away the low rates. Yeah.
If people believe that it's right, but they know that other people believe it's still wrong, do they, why people don't, why most people don't get caught is because they do it so smart, and that they know it's wrong for everyone else, but it feels right for them, so that they know to hide it.
Okay, so you're thinking these rates would underestimate a lot because it's not that people aren't reoffending, it's that they realized, okay, I got to be smarter about this, and they just, so they like it, but they know that other people think it's bad, so they're okay. Yeah, and again, this is certainly an underestimate, right? I don't mean to suggest that it's not. And in no way does this minimize any recidivism is a problem, right? In no way does it say that, hey, we don't have to worry about this, it's not a problem. That's not at all what I'm trying to suggest here. What it is that we, being aware of what the official rates are, again, has serious implications for how we manage offenders and what we do with them. So some people, for example, might say, well, our policy should be to incarcerate everybody forever. All sex offenders, right? And I'm sure there's some people that would endorse that policy and that approach here, and that's fine. But if we think about what we're trying to do and the resources that we have and the effectiveness of the policies and approaches we're doing for keeping the community safe, if that's our primary concern, then that's a lot of money incarcerating, 75% or higher of these individuals forever, which is very expensive, as you probably have seen in your classes already, for each offender when they're not likely to reoffend. So the rates are low, but there are some markers, just like with general kind of crime, there are some markers that predict reoffending, sexual reoffending, and we can focus on those markers and combine them to identify offenders that do have an elevated risk of reoffending. So although it's low overall, or again, at least by our official sources, right, it's low overall, we can identify subgroups of offenders that have a really high risk, and then with those guys, it makes sense to take more drastic measures, right? Maybe those guys you do want to incarcerate forever, right? Maybe that's a smart move. Things like that are sort of more of a community kind of decision, not necessarily a research issue, but certainly maybe, incapacitation is the right move for people that are really, really persistent offenders, or more intense treatment, or whatever, more security, more supervision, whatever the case may be, but more drastic measures where somebody who has a really low risk of reoffending, for that person, maybe these kind of drastic measures are not the best use of our resources. So what are some of the predictors? Well, there's been a couple of meta-analyses. Carl Hansen is a huge name in this area. I don't know if anybody heard of Carl Hansen? Anybody know that name? No? Okay. Carl Hansen is a sort of a big influence and big name in this area. He's at Public Safety Canada, just down the road, just at Laurier and Bank. Been there for a number of years and doing big and important work in this area, specifically, well, mostly in risk assessment and sort of treatment evaluations and things like that. Basically, how can we better manage offenders to keep people safe? So one of the big meta-analyses he did, one of the first big ones in this area, he'd done others, but was looking at these predictors, and a lot of them were fairly simple predictors. So he's done a more recent one, but I'm going to give you the first one so we look at some of the key basic kind of predictors that will then come back when we look at one of the risk assessment instruments. So these are just some simple sort of demographic kind of offense characteristics. What do we have here? I don't know if you guys are familiar with meta-analysis. It doesn't matter too much for this stuff, but essentially just averaging the differences between sexual recidivists, so the number of the people that do recidivate sexually in the follow-up time compared to the people that don't commit a new sex offense in the follow-up time. Right? And we have information about them before they were released, let's say. So we know how old they were. We might know how many offenses they had in the past. We might also know a bunch of other things about them. All right, and let's see if we can, let's follow them up for 5, 6, 2, 20, whatever, however many years we can, and let's see who reoffends and who doesn't, and then let's compare those who do reoffend to those who don't reoffend on a number of characteristics to see if we can distinguish them. Right? Are there some key factors that really, wow, okay, yeah, they're really different on this, that we may then be able to use to predict the future behavior of people we're thinking about releasing or trying to figure out how to manage. Right? It makes sense, seems the smartest way to do it. So he combined all these studies, and there's a lot of them out there, and these are some of the key ones that popped up. So the average correlation, the average effect size, right, between prior sex offenses and committing a new sex offense. Or another way to think about it is the average difference in the number of prior sex offenses that recidivists had compared to non-recidivists. Right? How big is that difference? Well, here for prior sex offenses, correlation of 0.19. Not a huge effect. I mean, if we found this, if we were all doing a study for your honors thesis or whatever else, whatever other kind of research you might be doing, and you found a correlation of 0.19, you probably wouldn't be, having a big party and celebrating. It's not terribly exciting. But relative to what some of the other findings were, this was sort of some of the best and strongest effects. Not the strongest, but among some of the things that were considered worthy of consideration and worth noting and using to try to predict recidivism. And they are quite simple, right? So prior sex offenses, that kind of makes sense. As Adele always cites, I think it's Thorndike that you refer to, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? It kind of makes sense. If you committed a bunch of sex offenses in the past, it's probably a good bet that you're more likely than someone who hasn't committed any in the past to commit more in the future, right? That just seems obvious. And it's sort of borne out there, right? We're seeing correlation of 0.19. What about age? Well, pretty consistent findings that younger people are more likely to commit crime in general, right? You guys are on average, you guys are much more likely to commit crime than I am, right? I'm sure most of you won't do any crime, you're all good people, but so a negative correlation there, 0.13. And the relationship with age and sexual recidivism is actually quite complex, but generally you do see a difference there, right? If you're releasing a guy at 80 compared to a guy at 20, the guy at 20, all things being equal, is going to be more likely to commit a new sex offense than the guy at 80. Never married, so never having been in a sort of common law, living together kind of relationship. That's associated with higher rates of sexual recidivism. Right? So somebody who's in a relationship is less likely to sexually recidivate in a living romantic relationship. Somebody who has victimized strangers, people they didn't know at least a day before the offense typically, they're more likely to sexually reoffend. People who have victimized unrelated victims, children unrelated to them, are more likely to sexually reoffend than those who have related victims, right? Who victimized their children, their nieces, their nephews, things like that. And offenders who have had male child victims, are also more likely to sexually reoffend. Okay, a more recent meta-analysis by Carl and colleagues, including those studies we just talked about, but a number of new ones, they didn't look at these sort of predictors here because in their mind, these have been addressed. They know what's going on. This is covered, right? So they left those and focused on some more, I guess, interesting, for lack of a better word, variables, and more controversial and curious variables. So to give you the punchline, I guess, of the results of their meta-analysis, basically the two strongest predictors of sexual recidivism seem to be sexual deviance and antisocial orientation, or antisociality, or criminality, or however you want to conceptualize it. So most clearly, sexual interest in children is a strong predictor of sexual reoffending. Okay, and these sort of antisocial characteristics like psychopathy, but not limited to psychopathy, could be just sort of antisocial personality disorder, or just characteristics, antisocial characteristics, impulsivity, hostility. Somewhat surprisingly, depending on who you are, but maybe based on what we've been talking about, you're a bit surprised to find that sexual interest in rape was not a significant predictor of sexual recidivism. You know, it seems to differentiate rapists from non-rapists, right? As we talked about before, rapists show greater interest in sexual assault and rape than do people who don't sexually assault people, who non-rapists, right? So why wouldn't it be predictive of sexual recidivism? It seems like it should be, right? So, well, I mean, they are two different things, right? We could have something that would distinguish people who start doing something from those who never start doing it, and that thing may not then predict among those who started who persists and who doesn't persist, right? That's possible. It might just be two separate kind of issues, and it's related to one but not the other. It's possible. And some people do argue that it also has a lot to do with the way these things are measured. And some people argue that it's not measured properly by some groups, researchers. The people who are accused of doing a poor job of measuring typically argue that the difference has to do with the populations that are studied. So they argue that the only time you find that sort of arousal to rape is a good predictor is among sort of sadistic kind of offenders. Right? Those kind of offenders we were talking about before, they're really turned on and like the violence. That's what they're into. That's their thing. As opposed to the other kind of guys we were talking about that just sort of, yeah, violence, no violence, I don't care. So you sort of have these two explanations. It's not really clear at this point what's necessarily happening, but so some groups still argue that arousal to rape is a good predictor of sexual recidivism. But on average, it didn't pan out. Okay, so these two things kind of make sense, right? If you think about them both, you know, I think it's a bit surprising. I know when this stuff first started coming out, I was a bit surprised about the antisocial orientation being a good predictor. Because, I mean, it's not sexual, right? Somebody likes to beat people up, or likes to, you know, steal things, or doesn't like to work, or likes to scam people, or is a general jerk. I wouldn't think of that as being related to sex offending necessarily, right? It doesn't sound, you know, sexual deviance, yeah, that makes sense. If they like doing this sort of thing, then yeah, why wouldn't they want to do it? But, so it's, again, for me it was sort of surprising, but in hindsight it's quite obvious, right? That those two things would be important. If you like doing something, and you also don't particularly care about hurting people, then, you know, it kind of makes sense that those two things go together quite nicely, right? And would sort of facilitate each other. So I gave you the punchline. Here's the background. Here are the actual data looking at the predictors. These predictors are sort of superordinate groups. They're general groups that include individual kind of markers or predictors that were examined for each one. So sexual deviancy is the penile plethysmography that I was talking about, the physiological measure of arousal or erection in response to various stimuli, but also looking at other ways of measuring that. Okay, self-report, right? Fantasy questionnaires, what do you think about, what do you like, right? A number of other ways of looking at that. So on average, you're finding a pretty big effect. Cohen's d is about 2 times the correlation. And I don't know how much these effects make sense or resonate with you, these effect sizes and this kind of stuff. But if if it does make sense to you and you sort of have a good handle on correlation coefficients and meta-analyses with those, the Cohen's d translates to a correlation by just generally by multiplying it by 2. Okay, so a Cohen's d of 0.30 is roughly equivalent to a correlation of 0.15. So sexual deviancy, one of the strongest predictors coming out. Again, antisocial orientation, as I said, those are the top two. Right? So if you were doing a risk assessment, you wanted to predict or somehow estimate the reoffense rates or figure out who to keep in, who to let go, whatever it is you're trying to do. Right? And you could only focus on two things with the offenders. What would they be? Well, you'd want to focus on their sexual interests and on their antisocial orientation. Right? Those would be, if you could only know two things, those would be the most important things for you to assess and investigate and explore and get a sense of to figure out how likely this person is to reoffend or not. Yeah?
Are these sexual offenders in Canada or in North America?
Good question. So are these offenders in Canada or North America? Well, there'll be offenders all over the place. So these are studies from, I don't remember the breakdown, but certainly not just Canada. So we do a lot of research on this here because we have good records for following up offenders, generally, not just sex offenders, but certainly a lot of stuff in the States, New Zealand, Europe, all kinds of places. What about those attitudes things? So we talked about attitudes before, right? Beliefs, these cognitive distortions, offense-supportive beliefs about abusing children, offense-supportive beliefs about sexual assault, right? These kind of things. Well, not a huge effect. The authors and people do consider it important, and it has been looked at in other sort of research and assessment protocols. But so it's in there. It makes the cut. It's still included in things that are worthy of consideration, but clearly not as powerful as the sexual deviance and antisocial orientation. Specifically looking at the sexual attitudes, think sort of general, I guess, attitudes supportive of sex offending, in general, those were predictive, significantly predictive of sexual recidivism. But more specific attitudes or beliefs like offense-supportive beliefs, or beliefs supporting child molestation, rather, or child sexual abuse specifically, those didn't seem to be really good predictors of recidivism, of sexual reoffending among these sex offenders. Right? So that's kind of curious, and again, seems somewhat at odds with the stuff we were talking about before for initiation. Intimacy deficits, that's a big one, and you think back to that theory we talked about in the beginning, right? That sort of trajectory where somebody has a rough childhood, they don't have very good relationships, partly because they're not able to secure them, right? They don't have the skills, they don't have the confidence, they don't have the ability to make these nice, supportive, happy relationships, to feel close to someone. Right? So intimacy deficits are sort of big. They get talked a lot about in this area, big treatment target, big theory sort of idea, big models that this is implicated in why someone would offend. It fits with Finkelhor's model and all kinds of other things. Again, it makes the cut according to the most researchers and the way that these things are dealt with, and that it's considered to be an important one, but again, clearly not sort of up at the top. Okay, so what seems to come out mostly, this is mostly a reflection of that idea of ever married. If you ever had a sort of live-in kind of romantic relationship with someone for some reasonable period of time, that seems to be a good predictor. Certainly stability of your relationship and things like that seem to be important as well. But interestingly, things like loneliness didn't come out as a good predictor of sexual reoffending. And that's certainly contrary to the way people view the maintenance process and the initiation process. And again, I think that's considered one important thing. Or people feel lonely, they can't have these relationships, they then turn to these alternate ways of trying to meet their needs. Right? And that wasn't really supported in those findings. The line that I've drawn there is sort of, that's the cut, right? Everything, the way the authors have sort of conceptualized it, everything below that line is crap. Okay? So everything above that line is worthy of consideration, potentially important. Everything below that line, it's not that it's crap, but it's that if you have to focus on certain things, as we usually do, we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited resources, we don't have unlimited energy or money, right? So often we do need to sort of focus our energies on assessing and dealing with certain things. So they're saying if you're going to look at a few things, these are considered, there's probably not much going on there. They're probably not that important. So adverse childhood environments, again, we think back to that theory, that was a big one, right? Poor childhood, bad childhood, neglectful, abusive, all that kind of stuff. And certainly many offenders have terrible, horrible childhoods, right? And for sex offenders, that's often the case. They seem to be coming from horrible situations quite often. But it didn't seem to predict sexual recidivism. So whether they had been abused, sexually abused as children or not, the recidivism rates were equal, roughly equal, right? So that's not differentiating those groups. Whether they'd been physically abused or not, again, so recidivism rates similar, right? So these kind of things, parenting experiences, negative childhood experiences, negative parenting, that sort of stuff, wasn't generally a good predictor of sexual recidivism. There's some exceptions in there, but those are the two big ones that I just talked about that I think most people think of, and those ones didn't pan out as good predictors of reoffending. What about general psychological problems, things like self-esteem, right? As you've probably already covered in your sentencing and sentencing chapter, right? Self-esteem, some of the things that sort of are generally considered not particularly important in the psychology of criminal conduct by Andrews and Bonta and people like that for general kind of crime and managing offenders generally, not just sex offenders. Some similar findings here where things like self-esteem, things like depression, things like anxiety, right? Those kind of psychological characteristics that I would assume many of you think would be important for this kind of behavior. Certainly self-esteem is a big one for crime in general. I think people like that explanation, that people feel bad about themselves. Poor Billy is just a trembling little boy inside, and that's why he does these horrible things to people, right? For recidivism, that doesn't seem to be a good predictor, although there's been a recent study after this meta-analysis was worked out that did find quite a huge effect, actually, huge difference in self-esteem between sexual recidivists and non-recidivists in the UK. So those who did go on to sexually recidivate had considerably lower self-esteem than those who didn't sexually reoffend. But that's only one study, not a huge sample size, and this average effect, we need to see a bit more research on that before we necessarily change our position here or jump on the bandwagon for self-esteem. Yeah, and again, anxiety, depression, all that kind of stuff doesn't seem that useful in predicting sexual recidivism. Clinical presentation is a real hodgepodge and really interesting in terms of what isn't predictive in there. It's a lot of the things that I think most of you and certainly myself would think should be predictive and should matter. So a clinical presentation might be, say, motivation for treatment, right? I'm sure for most of you, you would think, well, this guy, I have this guy in my treatment program. This guy's gung-ho, he's showing up early, he's, he wants to do all the work, he's really serious, right? Whereas I have this guy who's slacking, he's talking all the time, he's not paying attention, right? Just annoying, right? Who's more likely to sexually reoffend, right? I think you'd think it's the idiot, right? It's not the hardworking, serious one, right? But no, there's no difference between those two, at least in the studies that we've looked at. Right? What about denial? Well, I think for most people, again, we'd think if you have a guy who's saying, yes, I did it, I'm sorry, it was all my fault, I take full responsibility, it was a terrible thing I did, and a guy who's saying, it wasn't me, wasn't there, she's lying, or some variation on that, right? Again, I think we would think, if we're convinced that they did it, I mean, maybe we believe them, but if we believe that he actually did it, right, and we have the denier and the admitter, I think most of us would think, well, that guy's definitely less likely to reoffend. This guy's a jerk, he's going to reoffend, right? So, but again, on average, no, we're not seeing those differences. The admitter generally is no less likely to sexually reoffend than the denier. Some other things, empathy for victims, again, at least as it's been measured and it's been looked at, doesn't seem to be a good predictor of sexual recidivism. So offenders that are expressing empathy, saying, yes, I feel bad for victims, I know the victims suffer, I know this is harmful, right? I know my victim suffered, all that sort of stuff, compared to ththose who are saying, it's no big deal, or I don't know what you're talking about, or they show no appreciation for the suffering of their victims. Again, you're not seeing difference. So I don't know about you, but these are quite counterintuitive to me. I would expect that you'd see big differences there. The denier is more likely to reoffend, the unempathic more likely to reoffend, the unmotivated more likely to reoffend, right? That makes sense. But you don't see those, at least as it's been measured, right? These aren't sort of closed books. There's a lot of work to do in these, and the research has a lot of weaknesses. But from the evidence that we have, those things don't generally pan out. Although we did do a study a little while ago where we did actually find that denial was predictive of sexual recidivism, but only for certain kinds of offenders. So it was more for the lower risk offenders than the higher risk offenders. Okay, so for lower risk offenders, denial was associated with increased risk of sexual recidivism, but for the higher risk offenders, it actually almost seemed to be the opposite, that the deniers were almost less likely to sexually reoffend than the admitters. So it's sort of a confusing, unclear picture that's happening there, but there may be certain offenders for whom denial is important. But on average, if you're just looking at offenders across the board, there don't seem to be differences there. And it probably has to do with why people deny and what denying and admitting means. Right? Probably means different things for different people, and people probably do it for different reasons. Some people it might be to protect their self-esteem. Other people it might be a manifestation of antisociality, manipulation, right? Trying to pull the wool over your eyes. There seems to be an interaction between sexual deviance and antisociality. So they're the two top predictors, right? But together, right, when they're combined, they seem to be really powerful, right? They seem to make a fairly scary individual who's very likely to sexually reoffend. There's been quite a few studies that have looked at this point, and they pretty consistently find this interaction. So what do we mean by an interaction? Well, again, basically, it seems like when those two things are together, the combination, recidivism risk goes through the roof. Right? So if you have somebody who's both sexually deviant and psychopathic, their risk is really high, whereas if you have somebody who's low on both, their risk is exceptionally low, basically. Okay. A lot of ways to assess risk, a lot of measures. I'm not even going to talk about half of these, but just to give you a sense, there's a lot out there. I'm only going to talk about the static 99. I think there's a few talked about in your book. It's an actuarial measure. It's based largely on some of the meta-analytic results, and you'll see some of those items we looked at: never married, gender of victim, unrelated victims, things like that, number of sex offenses in the past, things like that. This is what it looks like here. So if you were an assessor doing a risk assessment on an offender, you would undoubtedly want to fill out one of these. You might want to do other things as well, but this would be one that you'd want to do. I don't know if you can read that. I think the items are listed in your book, but you give you a nice sense of how this is coded and what you would actually work with if you were doing it. So if the offender is 25 or older, right, they get a score of 0. Ever lived with a partner, as I said, for at least 2 years. Right? Do they have any index sexual violence? This is non-sexual violence. This is sort of coming from another measure that they used. But again, it makes sense from the antisociality perspective, right? If there's non-sexual violence there, that would suggest antisociality. Not that sex offending doesn't, but the non-sexual violence certainly provides another, important piece of information. And again, you can see all these down here: prior sex offenses, et cetera, et cetera. So the static 99, as the name suggests, taps into static variables, but there's other considerations, right? Static variables are good, and generally they predict sex offending well. So they're not changeable with intervention, right? Things like prior sex offenses are a good example. Dynamic variables, though, are potentially changeable with intervention. And we can conceptualize those in a number of ways, but there's sort of two broad categories that they're broken into: stable and acute. So stable, it sounds kind of like an oxymoron, right? Stable dynamic predictors, it sounds kind of, the opposite, but they would just simply be slowly changing, right? So it's something that can change with intervention, but it's not something that changes from minute to minute or day to day, right? Something that would be relatively stable in someone and then change over time. So sexual preoccupation is a good example of that, and that's a predictor that's used in some dynamic measures. So somebody that's always thinking about sex, going to strip joints all the time, frequenting prostitutes, internet, porn, that kind of stuff, just constantly, right? That's something they're always thinking about, they're always into, devote a disproportionate amount of their time and energy and thoughts to that sort of thing. That's something you'd expect to be sort of slowly changing if it's a strong characteristic of the person. Acute variables, quickly changing, and this is, again, things like negative mood, right? And alcohol is another good example. You think about alcoholism, that would be sort of a stable kind of dynamic factor, right? If you have a serious problem with alcohol that has persisted over time, chances are that's probably fairly stable, right? We can work on that, or you can work on that and try to, wean yourself off and change things, and it's certainly possible and doable. But you wouldn't expect it to change, from day to day, right? It's something that would take a bit of work. Whereas intoxication is something that could change, right? You could be drunk out of your mind last night, but hopefully you're not drunk this morning, right? So we can have, fluctuations from day to day and even from hour to hour in that. So the stable 2007 and acute 2007 are two measures that Carl Hansen, again, and colleagues designed and have been working on for, I think, probably over a decade now, to try to tap into the stable thing. So we have the static factors, right, with the static 99, but what about these dynamic factors? So they developed the stable to look at stable dynamic factors and the acute to look at acute dynamic factors. The way it's scored is from interview, file information on an offender, and any other kind of information you can get. The stable section would be scored based on sort of the person's typical functioning over the last year. So where are they at? How are they doing? The acute dynamic section is scored on more recent change since the last time you saw them. So if you're a probation officer or a parole officer, for example, and you saw them last week, how are they doing compared to last week? Okay, so the stable looks good. It includes a lot of information that people like and clinicians and are interested in and think is important, which is good. But always the bottom line is it empirically related to reoffending, right? If it doesn't show an empirical relationship, then who cares if it looks good, right? If it's going to be worth doing, it's because there's some evidence that it does work, right? That it accurately distinguishes those who are going to reoffend from those who don't or who won't. So they did a huge prospective study, which is rare for this area, and I think maybe in aggression and violence in general. Prospective study of almost 1,000 sex offenders, and they did find that the stable 2007 demonstrated incremental validity over the static 99. They also found that the acute demonstrated incremental validity over the static 99 and the stable 2007. Does anybody know what we mean by that, by incremental validity? No? Basically, all it means is that you have your static 99, right? And if we look back at it, right, it's pretty simple, right? It's pretty straightforward. Looking at age, number of offenses, right? You don't have to be a clinical psychology PhD to know how to do this, right? You don't need decades of training. You don't have to be a forensic psychiatrist. You probably don't even need an undergraduate degree to be able to do this well. As long as you read the manual, are conscientious, diligent, and have good file information, you could probably score this as well as anybody else can, right? Whereas the stable, although I don't have it up here, it's a big sort of protocol. You're doing all kinds of talking to the person, you're spending time with them, you're scoring this information. It's much more difficult to score. Okay, so we want to show not only that the stable is predictive and the acute is predictive of sexual recidivism, which it was, right? It was significantly related to sexual recidivism, which is the first important question. But the second important question is, does it add anything to the static 99? Right, to these simple static variables, will it tell us anything else? Right, so if you're an assessor, if you're doing a risk assessment, and you have a static 99 on the guy, is it going to be worth it to do this other assessment? Is it going to tell you anything more and make your estimates any more accurate? If it's not, then it's not worth doing, right? Why would you do it? Go have a coffee, right? Go take a break, right? Why would you do these big assessments on the guy, interview them, waste a bunch of time if it doesn't make your predictions any more accurate or your estimates any more accurate? So incremental validity simply just means that it is making the predictions more accurate. It's giving you more information, it's complementing, it's not redundant, it's giving you additional independent information that you can use to sort of get a bigger piece of the pie, if you will. Right? So you know this much information with the static, but you can get more and more and more if you use the stable, and even more if you use the acute. Okay, so bottom line is that translates into more accurate estimates of reoffense risk, which translate into safer management of offenders, right? Less of those incidents where somebody gets out and reoffends and it turns out that somebody said they were a low risk or something, right? And encourage people to let them out or something like that. How do these things fit together? It's not always obvious, I don't think, but they fit together really well. Like, why do them? If the stable tells you everything, then why do a static, right? Why look at these static variables? Well, the static variables, like in measures like the static 99, sort of give you an idea of the person's baseline of risk, right? Their enduring, sort of stable propensity for reoffense. Stable 2007, or measures like that look at stable dynamic factors, what do they tell you about? Well, they give you an idea of what to work on in treatment, right? If we look at the static 99, if you're a treatment provider, what are you going to do? You're going to try to wait till the guy gets older? You're going to try to get him married? That's really all that you can do. There's nothing else there, right? And obviously, you're not going to do that. That doesn't make any sense as a treatment provider. It might happen on its own, but that's not something you'd want to work on, right? You can't change his number of prior sex offenses. You can't change the fact that he has male victims. You can't change the fact that he has unrelated victims, right? You can't change any of that. It's done. So it's a good predictor of sexual recidivism, but it's not a good informant for your efforts to change this person, right? To reduce their reoffending. So the Stable 2007 does offer you a bunch of things like that. It looks at things like social influences, intimacy deficits, or intimate relationships, right? Social rejection, loneliness, a whole number of other, sexual interests, a whole number of other variables. So these are things that you can work on in treatment. And if it's a problem for the person, based on your assessment, you could try to change. And you could use the Stable to measure the change on those targets. Okay? So you can get a sense of, are they doing better? They did a bunch of treatment. Are they now lower risk than they were when they started this prison sentence or this treatment program or whatever else? The acute gives you an idea of when recidivism might be imminent. So if you're a parole officer or a probation officer in the community, your guy comes in, or your woman or whoever comes in, and you do this assessment on them, and you get a sense, hey, things are much worse than last time. They seem to be abusing alcohol, they seem much more hostile, they suddenly got a job as a Boy Scout volunteer, these other things are happening, okay, check, 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 right? These are all items on that measure. Well, not specifically, but the general areas are targeted, like victim access, right? Substance abuse, all these things. If all these things are all of a sudden going on for the person and they weren't before, the alarm bells go off, and it suggests that reoffense, not only that reoffense is likely, but the reoffense is likely now, right? So one gives you an overall baseline with the static. The Stable gives you an idea of what to do and how to measure if you're doing a good job with it, if they're changing. And the acute gives you an idea from day to day how likely or unlikely is it, how dangerous or not dangerous is this person. And all of them obviously come together. What do you do with offenders? We talked about the idea of putting them in prison. I think a lot of people like that idea for various reasons. One reason people like it, I think, is because they feel that sex offenders deserve punishment. And part of the purpose of sentencing is to sort of have the punishment fit the crime, so that may be reasonable. But another reason for prison sentences that judges endorse quite often, that I think a lot of us endorse or think works, and certainly politicians seem to endorse and think is important, is that it deters reoffending, right? If we lock them up, if we let these guys go too easy, they're just going to think, oh, it's no big deal, I'll just reoffend again, right? I went to jail for a week, or I didn't go to jail at all. What's the big deal? Why should I stop offending, right? And I think that makes sense intuitively. I don't want to go to jail. I'm sure most of you don't want to go to jail. If somebody told me to stop drinking water or they were going to put me in jail, I'd probably stop drinking water, right? Makes sense. It makes sense to me that it would work. But just like general reoffending, for sex offenders, the evidence suggests that prison isn't a particularly good deterrent of reoffending. So once they get out, and most do, right? Most sex offenders aren't in prison forever, right? So once they get out and move back to our neighborhoods, and my neighborhood and your neighborhood, right? Whether they've been to prison or not, whether they got a prison sentence or not, doesn't seem to make a difference in how likely they are to reoffend, on average. Okay, we did this study looking at this. We tried to control for risk, their pre-sentence risk level. Right? So maybe the really high-risk guys are getting prison, and maybe that's sort of confusing or mixing up the situation. But even when we control for their risk level, right, and we control for a number of other things and look at a number of other factors, we didn't find any relationship there. Prison didn't seem to make a difference. Didn't seem to reduce their rates of reoffending. Okay, so prison doesn't seem to work. What about treatment? Well, treatment does seem to work. I don't have time to talk to you about the different approaches to treatment and different things that are done, but in a big meta-analysis, one of the biggest ones to date that Lozel and Schmucker have done recently, they found that, yeah, you're not seeing huge differences, but they are significant, and given the low rates of recidivism on average, of sexual recidivism on average, they're not bad. So you're seeing differences, 6.4 percentage points, lower sexual recidivism rates among the treated offenders compared to the untreated offenders. And then I have the rates there for violence and any recidivism as well. So just to sum up quickly, going back to the initiation stuff, a number of factors, not just one, likely play a causal role in sex offending, why people do this in the first place. Right. The sexual recidivism rates are generally low, at least as far as we know and as far as we can tell. But we are able to identify subgroups with these often quite simple little demographic and offense and victim kind of variables. We're often able to identify offenders who do have an elevated risk of reoffense, one that we would be worried about, and people that we would want to target with more extreme measures to keep the community safe. And that can be done by assessing their static and their dynamic risk factors. And finally, treatment does appear to reduce sexual recidivism, but, and I didn't have time to get into it, but there are a lot of weaknesses and challenges with that research, and more research is needed to clarify that. So that's it.